You are listening to the Tales of Conundrum podcast, episode 15, Return of Monkey Paw. Part 1, The Ancient Burial and the Discovery. In the pale glow of a waning moon in the year 1902, a gaunt figure stood knee-deep in an isolated stretch of woodland. This man, hollow-eyed and trembling, was known simply as Henry Whitehall to those who might recall him in better days. Tonight, he was scarcely recognizable, a father pushed to the very edges of his sanity, cradling in his arms a cold, lifeless bundle. His son, or rather the ghastly remnant that was once his son, lay unresponsive. Moments earlier, Henry had issued the final wish that would release the boy's tortured soul from its unnatural half-life. The mocking hush of the surrounding trees felt like a silent chorus to his despair. He had ventured here in secret after concluding there was no turning back from the horror he had unleashed. The dread object responsible, that twisted relic known as the monkey's paw, weighed heavily in his coat pocket, throbbing with a sickening sort of presence. Only minutes before, Henry had watched his son's eyes stare up at him, lifeless and yet animated by some perverse spark. The injuries from the factory machine were so severe that the child's return to the living realm offered no comfort, only macabre suffering. In a trembling voice, Henry made the fateful wish for his son's suffering to end once and for all. A moment later, he felt the boy go limp and saw the dreadful spark vanish from the child's eyes. Now, the father trudged further into the wild, every step pulling him deeper into the embrace of tall, silent pines. A single lantern lit the way, casting a wavering circle of orange across a forest floor thick with gnarled roots. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Henry's mind echoed with guilt and regret, but he was determined to bury the evil paw where it could never be discovered again. Reaching a secluded clearing, he knelt down amid the undergrowth. His breath plumed in the cold night air as he gently placed the bundled body of his son aside. Then, clutching the paw with trembling fingers, he raked loose dirt into a makeshift grave. The paw itself felt strangely warm, as though possessed of a beating heart. It seemed to pulse against his palm, resisting every attempt to hide it beneath the soil. Henry muttered desperate pleas under his breath, entreaties that this vile artifact remain forever hidden, that no other family would ever suffer as he had. That final wish unspooled in his mind like a haunting refrain. Let no one find you. Let no one awaken your curse again. The last spadeful of earth fell with a dull thud, and Henry placed a rough-hewn stone marker atop the makeshift plot, though he doubted he would ever return to this sorrowful spot. Despite the night's chill, sweat clung to his brow. He stooped to collect his lifeless son, intending a more dignified burial for him in consecrated ground. Still, a piece of him feared the paw might stir, might fight its way back to the surface to perpetuate its horrific magic. As he turned away, the wind unleashed a sudden gust that extinguished his lantern. Darkness swallowed the clearing so completely that he nearly lost his footing. In that moment of pitch-black terror, Henry's heart thundered. He half expected to hear a scratch, a crack, or even a whispered mockery of fate. Instead, the night remained silent, and Henry staggered away with grief as his only companion. The monkey's paw, now interred beneath the soil, lingered in the earth's embrace, as though the ground itself recoiled from its presence. Time marched forward, leaving those sorrowful events buried under layers of rumor and oblivion. By the year 2025, the once desolate woodland had transformed into a sprawling suburban development known as Pinewood Acres. Rows of meticulously trimmed hedges lined streets named after the region's natural features: Forest Trail, Willow Bend, Twilight Hollow. No trace remained of the remote clearing where Henry Whitehall had taken such painstaking care to hide his nightmare. In its place stood newly built homes, lawns dotted with barbecues and children's playsets. The relentless expansion of modern life had quietly erased the solitude that once shrouded the paw's hidden resting place. The Thompson family home was perched at the edge of a narrow cul-de-sac called Old Timber Way. It had a wide backyard bordered by an old fence and a lone, towering pine that somehow escaped the developer's axe. Nick and Brenda Thompson, along with their two children, Lisa, aged 10, and Sam, aged 8, had moved in just a year prior. Their house, painted a soft shade of cream, exuded an inviting warmth. On weekends, Nick mowed the lawn while the children squealed on the swings. It was the quintessential suburban scene, a vivid contrast to the haunting legacy that lay deep beneath the surface. On a bright Saturday morning, the sun ascended in a flawless blue sky, and Lisa and Sam begged to play outside. They bounded across the grass in search of buried treasure, an imaginative game fueled by a school project on archaeology. Sam brandished a small spade, and Lisa carried an old plastic bucket. She had discovered a book about Egyptian tombs at the library, and was convinced they might unearth something spectacular if they dug deep enough. Sam, for his part, was content to shovel dirt and dream about finding dinosaur bones. Their enthusiasm echoed in lively chatter. They picked a spot not far from the pine tree, where the ground felt oddly softer. The grass was patchy, hinting that the soil underneath might be looser there. Lisa sank the spade in with a theatrical flourish. Each scoop of earth landed in the bucket, occasionally exposing small rocks or tangled roots. Sam let out a triumphant whoop whenever his shovel hit anything other than plain dirt. They worked with that tireless focus children bring to self-invented games. The sun rose higher, the day growing warmer, but they paid no mind. Several minutes later, Lisa's spade struck something that gave off a dull, hollow sound. She paused, her eyes gleaming with excitement. "I've found something," she cried out. Sam scrambled over, eager to be part of the discovery. The object was neither stone nor bone, at least not in any shape they recognized. Lisa scraped away the packed soil around it, revealing the outline of a shriveled, leathery thing. The siblings exchanged puzzled glances. Sam wrinkled his nose, a flicker of revulsion crossing his face. It looked like it might be an animal's paw, though unlike any they had seen in their nature documentaries. They pried it free of the dirt, bits of soil crumbling off the narrow fingers and the tuft of dull hair near what appeared to be a wrist. The shape was that of a small hand, but elongated and grotesque. The digits were slightly curled, as if frozen in a final grasp. Lisa stared at it, a part of her intrigued. Sam, meanwhile, felt a surge of unease that made him recoil. Tiny nicks and splits across the grayish flesh hinted at advanced decay, yet the paw was rigid, too solid for something that should have rotted away decades ago. "What do you think it is?" Sam whispered, instinctively lowering his voice. He couldn't articulate why, but the pallid shape demanded a quieter tone. His imagination buzzed with half-formed notions, mutant animals, lost relics, and maybe cursed treasures from bedtime stories. Lisa, older by 2 years and emboldened by her newfound love of archaeology, tried to appear composed. She gently turned the paw over. Each finger had a faint curve, reminiscent of a human's hand, but definitely more simian if she compared it to pictures of monkeys she had seen. But something about it seemed off, inherently wrong, as though it carried an aura that resisted rational explanation. When Sam poked it hesitantly, he found it unexpectedly firm to the touch. That singular contact sent a disquieting tremor down his spine. Lisa quickly wrapped the paw in a spare cloth that she typically used for sifting dirt. "We should show this to Mom and Dad," she said, trying to sound confident, though her voice trembled. The object felt heavier than it looked, as though weighed down by an unseen burden. Sam nodded rapidly, wanting nothing more than to hand it over to an adult. His curiosity had just begun to give way to a raw sense of dread. They trudged back to the house, leaving the half-dug hole behind. The morning's adventurous spirit had vanished, replaced by a strange hush that clung to them like fog. As they stepped onto the porch, Lisa clutched the cloth bundle to her chest. Sam lagged behind, casting repeated glances at the yard as if expecting the ground to swallow itself up. Inside, Nick was washing dishes, humming off-key. At the sight of the children, he dried his hands, greeted them with a grin, but instantly sensed their unease. He lifted an eyebrow. "What did you find, kids?" Brenda, hearing the commotion, joined them in the living room. Lisa carefully placed the wrapped paw on the coffee table. "We found this, buried in the yard." Her voice trembled. She pulled back the cloth with deliberate caution, revealing the contorted shape. Brenda let out a soft gasp, while Nick leaned closer, his expression morphing from curiosity to alarm. The paw's sallow skin and ragged fur strips made it look like a macabre trophy torn straight from someone's nightmares. Sunlight from the window cast shadows across its surface, accentuating every withered fold. Nick, wanting to maintain a calm front, forced a half smile. "Well, that's definitely not something you see every day, he managed. He carefully lifted the paw, turning it over in his hands. It was stiff, yet not brittle. A faint musk, like aged leather, drifted from it. Brenda instinctively crossed her arms, as if warding off an unsettling chill. Although neither parent spoke aloud of the possibility, the shape and articulation of the digits strongly suggested it belonged to a primate, perhaps a monkey. But how would a monkey's paw end up buried here in a suburban backyard, of all places? Trying to project reassurance, Nick guided the children to the sofa and knelt before them. "We don't know exactly what it is," he said, "but it's probably an animal's foot or hand that someone buried a long time ago. Could be a weird prank, or maybe there was a traveling circus decades ago." Even as he offered these benign explanations, he felt an uneasy prickle on the back of his neck. The paw radiated an intangible menace that refused to fit any rational explanation. Brenda hovered nearby, her eyes never leaving the item. Her voice quivered when she finally spoke. "Should we call the police or animal control?" The words fell awkwardly. She too sensed there was something too bizarre about this relic for standard channels. Nick slowly shook his head, setting the paw gently back on the coffee table. "I'll call Larry," he decided. "He's a zoologist, knows more about unusual creatures than anyone else I can think of." Brenda nodded, relief flickering across her features. Larry had a broad range of knowledge, from exotic species to cryptozoological lore. If anyone could make sense of this discovery, it was him. Lisa tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mom, are we in trouble?" she asked, her voice small. The bravado she'd displayed outside had dissolved, replaced by a child's worry that she might have disturbed something best left alone. Brenda drew her into a comforting hug. "No, honey, you did nothing wrong." Sam sidled closer. He still felt the chill from that moment he'd touched the paw, an aftertaste of something vile lingering on his skin. Nick gave both kids a quick pat on the shoulder. "Try not to worry. We'll figure this out." Yet the silence that hung in the living room told a different story. Even the usual hum of the refrigerator and the distant buzz of traffic seemed muted, as though the paw's presence demanded reverent quiet. Nick placed a quick call to Larry, who promised to stop by within the next day or so. Lisa and Sam were sent to wash up, though each child lingered, eyes continually drawn to the sinister object. Brenda, who prided herself on composure, found her hands shaking slightly. She pressed them firmly together, as though trying to seal off a creeping dread. Nick tried to distract everyone by suggesting a trip to the local ice cream parlor that afternoon. Perhaps a bit of normalcy could break the spell of tension. Brenda nodded absently, still eyeing the paw. In the kitchen, Nick opened a nearby drawer and retrieved a large zip-top bag. With great care, he placed the paw inside, sealed it, and laid it in a small storage box. He'd handle it more thoroughly once Larry arrived. For now, it was enough to contain it physically, even if the sense of foreboding it radiated remained. As the children headed to their rooms to change, Lisa couldn't shake a wave of guilt. She wondered if maybe they should have left the paw buried. A faint echo of her earlier excitement about digging for treasure flickered, then vanished under the weight of an unspoken fear. Sam busied himself with rinsing off in the bathroom sink, scrubbing at his fingers as though contaminated by something intangible. He cast a nervous glance at his reflection, trying to bury the creeping dread behind an 8-year-old's bravado. Downstairs, Brenda and Nick stood side by side, momentarily lost in uneasy silence. Neither voiced it, but both felt the paw's presence like a dark lodestone, drawing their attention despite being enclosed in a box. "I'll show it to Larry," Nick reiterated, as though trying to convince himself that everything could be explained logically. "He'll probably just say it's some weird mummified monkey part that was dropped by someone ages ago." Brenda nodded, but her expression remained troubled. She placed a hand on Nick's shoulder. "What if it's something else?" she asked quietly. Nick forced a shaky grin, hoping to brush aside her apprehension. The notion of hidden secrets buried beneath their suburban paradise weighed on both of them. Pinewood Acres was meant to be a picturesque home, safe and mundane. It had never occurred to them that the land itself might carry a hush of forgotten tragedies or relics best left undisturbed. Nick was not a superstitious man, but a small voice inside him whispered that the paw's discovery was no ordinary fluke. He pushed the thought aside, determined to maintain a rational stance. "Don't worry," he insisted. "It's just a piece of old animal remains. Nothing more." Before they left for ice cream, Lisa and Sam trotted back downstairs. Both children wore guarded expressions, as though bracing for an admonishment or for the paw to leap out of its hiding place. Brenda ruffled Sam's hair, aiming a smile at them. "We'll figure it out," she murmured. The family stepped outside, greeted by a glorious afternoon sun. Yet as Nick locked the door behind them, all four felt a subtle heaviness in their chests, a sense that the house itself was harboring some dark occupant. For the rest of the day, they tried to distract themselves with normal routines: sweet cones of mint chocolate chip, a leisurely stroll past the local shops, and an evening movie. Yet, each time conversation drifted, it circled back to the paw. What was it really? Why hadn't it decomposed fully after all these years? Had they stumbled upon something more than just an odd curiosity? They kept these questions mostly unspoken, hoping that ignoring them might rob the paw of its eerie power. Still, in the back of their minds, each family member felt a quiet dread about what they had exhumed. Night came softly, the sky streaked with pale moonlight. The Thompson home settled into stillness, but none of them slept soundly. Lisa had a nightmare about digging holes in the yard that led to endless black tunnels filled with dusty hands reaching out. Sam woke up trembling, claiming he heard scratching noises by his bedroom window. Brenda lay awake, recalling the paw's curled digits, as though they clutched at her mind. Nick, who had tried to remain calm, found himself tossing and turning, his subconscious rummaging through cryptic images, half-buried figures, flickering lanterns, and a father's tearful face from a far-off year. The next morning dawned crisp but overcast, a grayish light sapping the neighborhood of its usual cheer. Lisa and Sam approached the breakfast table cautiously, exchanging glances that spoke volumes. Nick slid pancakes onto their plates, his eyes betraying restless fatigue. Brenda poured juice in silence. The family talked about going to the park later, but the conversation felt forced. The presence of the paw, sealed away though it was, loomed over them like a storm cloud. At one point, Lisa mustered the courage to ask if they could rebury it. Brenda bit her lip, glancing at Nick. The two parents had discussed it briefly the night before, but Nick insisted on showing it to Larry first. "He's coming tomorrow," Nick reminded them. "We'll know what we're dealing with by then." That promise hung in the air, neither reassuring nor definitive. Sam fiddled with his fork, his appetite dimmed by the memory of that leathery paw. An undercurrent of tension gripped them all. Their backyard now felt different, as though harboring the memory of that unearthing. The half-filled hole remained where Lisa and Sam had dug, a silent testament to their find. In the mid-morning drizzle, Nick wandered outside for a moment to stand by that spot. He stared at the disturbed earth, fighting an urge to refill it completely. Something about the yawning gap made him queasy, like staring into the mouth of a secret better left unsaid. Eventually he returned indoors, unsettled by how swiftly an ordinary backyard had become a place of whispered fears. While Nick busied himself with small chores to keep his mind off the paw, Brenda retreated into the living room, flipping absently through a local community newsletter. Her gaze kept drifting to the small storage box on the table, as if the paw might burst free at any second. She thought of calling her sister, but worried she'd sound hysterical describing a weird monkey hand they'd found. Instead, she sipped her lukewarm coffee, her thoughts swirling between dread and rational denial. Around noon, the clouds parted slightly, allowing a dim shaft of sunlight through the bay window. It illuminated the box on the coffee table, bringing the faintest glimmer to the plastic bag inside. Brenda caught herself staring and forced her eyes away. She decided to distract the children with baking, hoping the comforting smells of dough and cinnamon might chase away any lingering ghosts. Lisa and Sam complied, helping measure ingredients, but their usual giggles were subdued. The kitchen, typically a hub of warm chatter, felt quiet and tense. As dough rose in the oven, the children retreated to the living room. They crouched on the floor, flipping through pictures in an old encyclopedia. Sam found a page on mammals and primates, scanning the images for anything resembling the paw. He paused on a photograph of a monkey's hand and motioned for Lisa to look. The resemblance was undeniable, yet the paw they unearthed appeared older, more twisted, as though it had endured a tragedy that left an imprint on its very flesh. That notion unsettled both kids, though neither dared speak it. From the kitchen, Brenda could hear the low murmur of Lisa and Sam's discussion, but didn't catch their words. She longed to chase away their fears with a cheerful reassurance that all was normal. Yet she herself was plagued by the sense that the relic in their living room was anything but normal. Nick, too, sensed this unspoken tension. He found an excuse to check the mailbox, to take out the garbage, anything to step outside for fresh air and distance. But each time he returned, he felt the same soft shiver roll down his spine, as though crossing a threshold into a house that the paw now claimed as its domain. Evening approached more quickly than they anticipated. Over a dinner of baked chicken and roasted vegetables, the conversation skirted around the paw. Sam, in a small voice, asked, "Do you think it's dangerous?" Nick paused, carefully choosing his words. "We don't know yet, buddy. Larry's going to help us figure it out." Lisa added that maybe it was just an old piece of trash from a museum display. Brenda tried to nod encouragingly, but no one at the table was truly convinced. Afterwards, the children went to their rooms to work on school assignments, though their concentration was compromised by the day's events. Brenda joined Nick in the living room, where they silently watched the local news. A report on a stolen exotic animal from a nearby sanctuary flickered across the screen, prompting them both to share a glance. They quickly changed the channel, neither wanting to be reminded of any bizarre link between the paw and that local event. Night crept in, and with it came a restless hush. The air felt dense, as though the house itself was struggling to breathe. Nick paced, checking the locks on the doors, as if worried something outside might come searching for the item they possessed. Brenda finally turned off the television. "Let's just go to bed," she suggested. "Larry will be here tomorrow." Their bedroom, normally a place of solace, offered little comfort now. Both Nick and Brenda tossed and turned, drifting in and out of fitful dreams that teased them with half-glimpsed images of a sorrowful man burying something in the moonlit woods. Meanwhile, Lisa lay wide awake, the faint flicker of her nightlight casting strange shapes against the wall. She couldn't banish the sight of that paw from her thoughts. She tried to conjure up images of bright beaches and laughter with her friends, but the vision of curling, leathery fingers always clawed back. Sam, in the adjacent room, huddled under the blankets, praying for the morning to come quickly. He found himself staring at the shadows on the ceiling, imagining the paw crawling across the house like a scuttling creature with wicked intent. When dawn finally broke, the entire Thompson family felt exhausted, as though they'd battled unseen forces in their sleep. The anticipation of Larry's arrival was the lone thread of hope they clung to. Over scrambled eggs and toast, Nick tried to keep things light, joking about how Larry once dragged him along on a midnight hike looking for nocturnal wildlife. Brenda mustered a faint laugh. Lisa and Sam managed small smiles, though it was clear their hearts remained heavy. In the midst of this strained effort to appear normal, the phone buzzed. Nick answered, expecting Larry. Instead, it was a neighbor inviting him to a weekend barbecue. Nick found himself fumbling through an excuse. He simply wasn't in the mood. The neighbor remarked on his strange tone, but Nick brushed it off. When the call ended, he noticed Brenda's gaze trailing back to the storage box. Although the paw was out of sight, it lingered in their thoughts as palpably as if it sat in the center of the room, commanding their attention. Outside, a drizzle had begun, pattering softly against the windows. The pines that lent Pinewood Acres its name swayed with a sighing hush. If they could speak, they might have told of the father who once knelt in these woods under moonlight, burying a cursed relic. But now only the subtle rustle of needles broke the otherwise still air. Nick exhaled, checking his watch anxiously. He was counting down the hours until Larry arrived, hoping that the presence of a knowledgeable friend would restore a sense of order. Meanwhile, Lisa and Sam were encouraged to do their chores, folding laundry, tidying their rooms, but their minds repeatedly drifted back to the paw. Sam even considered sneaking a look at it, though the very thought made his stomach clench. Lisa wrestled with guilt, believing it had been her idea to dig that spot. She worried that she'd unleashed something harmful, that their normal life had been irreparably changed. She was only 10, yet an uneasy weight pressed upon her chest, the burden of a secret that could never be unlearned. The afternoon slogged on with leaden minutes. Brenda attempted some vacuuming, the drone of the machine a half-hearted effort to fill the oppressive silence. Nick busied himself with reading an article about local wildlife, half hoping to find a rational explanation for a stray monkey's paw. Nothing seemed to fit. This place was far from any tropics, and the notion of a traveling circus losing a monkey hand was bizarre at best. More troublingly, the paw's condition suggested something older, something that had lain hidden for a very long time, yet had not decayed as one would expect. Finally, as the sun slipped behind thick clouds, a flicker of headlights swept across the living room curtains. Nick glanced outside and saw Larry's vehicle pulling into the driveway. Relief mingled with apprehension. The moment of explanation was near, though none of the Thompsons could guess what that explanation might be. Brenda set down the vacuum handle, brushing her hair back into place. Nick straightened his shirt, a little self-conscious about the tension that likely radiated from every corner of the house. Lisa and Sam darted to the window, their expressions hopeful but anxious. Within moments, the front doorbell rang. Part 2. Expert Opinion and Emerging Doubts. Larry stepped over the threshold of the Thompson home with a subdued air, rainwater still gleaming on the shoulders of his safari-style jacket. A warm gust of indoor air met him, carrying the faint scent of coffee and lingering tension. Though he greeted the family in his usual genial manner, the subdued looks on their faces told him that this was no casual visit. With a duffel bag slung over one shoulder, he cast a quick gaze around the living room, noting the drawn curtains and the anxious glances of Lisa and Sam peeking from behind a doorway. Nick gestured for Larry to follow, and Brenda trailed a few steps behind. Despite the comforting glow of the lamp in the corner, a subtle chill seemed to cling to the house. Larry offered a polite smile, but his eyes flicked down to the sealed box resting on the coffee table, as though he already sensed that what lay inside might defy easy explanation. Nick led Larry toward the couch and invited him to sit. The children lingered in the hall, unsure if they were meant to stay or leave. Brenda perched on the arm of a chair, arms wrapped protectively across her middle, fingers tapping with a restless energy she could not entirely hide. "Thanks for coming," Nick said, attempting a lightness that did not quite ring true. Larry removed his jacket and laid it carefully across a nearby chair, his focus shifting to the box that Nick seemed almost reluctant to touch. There was a hint of moisture still clinging to Larry's hair from the drizzle outside, but his gaze was keen, betraying a deeply rooted curiosity. "You said you found something strange buried in the yard," he began, prompting Nick with a slight tilt of his head. Brenda exhaled quietly, as though she had been holding her breath ever since Larry walked in. Nick didn't immediately open the container. Instead, he launched into the story of how Lisa and Sam had been digging in the backyard the day before, discovering what looked like a mummified hand or paw. With each detail, how it felt unexpectedly heavy, how it retained a leathery stiffness, Brenda shifted, hugging herself a little tighter. Larry listened intently, not interrupting, though his posture grew more rigid. At the mention of the paw's unsettling appearance, his eyes narrowed. A faint flicker of recognition crossed his features, as though some obscure memory had been tugged to the surface. When Nick finished the brief summary, Larry cleared his throat and asked to see the artifact. Even before the box was opened, a charged hush fell over the room, as if everyone expected something uncanny to happen the moment the paw emerged. The children edged forward in the hallway, captivated by the interplay of adult voices, yet too apprehensive to join fully. Nick carefully reached over, flipped open the container, and removed the sealed bag. The paw lay within, its shriveled digits splayed in a macabre half-clutch. Brenda refused to look at it directly, instead focusing on Larry's expression. He took the bag in gloved hands, releasing a soft breath. "This is remarkable," he murmured, carefully turning it over. Lisa, peering around the doorway, noticed how Larry's brow furrowed, as though wrestling with a puzzle piece he couldn't quite place. Only then did Nick comment in a subdued tone that they believed it might be a monkey's paw. Larry nodded slowly, confirming that at a glance it did resemble a simian appendage. But after a moment of close inspection, the corner of his mouth tightened, and his eyes flicked up to meet Nick's. Brenda's breath hitched when Larry mentioned, almost offhandedly, that he had once heard rumors of an old legend. A cursed monkey's paw said to have brought tragedy to a family in a small town nearby back in 1902. Though he didn't elaborate in full, the notion hung in the air like a silent alarm. Lisa and Sam exchanged wide-eyed looks, as if they sensed that something far darker was at play than a mere archaeological curiosity. Nick forced a laugh, trying to dispel the tension. "You're not telling me you actually believe in curses, are you?" he asked, though his forced grin betrayed a trace of unease. Larry's gaze never left the paw. He simply shrugged. "I'm not saying I believe," he replied, his voice measured. "But I've heard the story from more than one source. It's odd, that's all." Brenda shivered and forced herself to approach, arms wrapped around her torso. She found it difficult to tear her eyes away from the paw. It seemed to have taken on a new weight now that Larry had voiced his suspicions. "If there's even the slightest chance this is that thing," she began, hesitating over the word cursed, "shouldn't we get rid of it?" Her question hovered, plaintive and urgent, but Nick shot her a look that suggested he wasn't quite ready to concede. He'd been wrestling with his own skepticism, yet an inkling of unexpected excitement flickered in his mind. If this relic was truly so infamous, perhaps it could be worth something. Yes, it was grotesque, but collectors often paid handsomely for the bizarre and rare. He mumbled something about not jumping to conclusions. Larry set the paw down gently and leaned back, removing the gloves from his hands. He began recounting a half-remembered tale, how a British family once claimed that a monkey's paw granted their wishes at terrible costs, leading to death and heartbreak. According to local lore, the paw vanished after being buried by a grieving father, never to be seen again. It was rumored to have been interred somewhere in this region, though no one knew precisely where. Larry said, his tone quieter now. "I always thought it was just a spooky legend people told around campfires." Brenda's expression soured, imagining her children unwittingly digging up something linked to an ancient tragedy. Lisa and Sam, still lurking at the edge of the room, felt an electric chill course through them. Neither dared speak, as though doing so might confirm the story's reality. Nick ran a hand through his hair and tried to keep his voice steady. "So let's say this is the same paw," he said, his tone half challenging, half intrigued. "What exactly are we dealing with? A haunted relic? A museum piece?" He cast a sidelong glance at Brenda, who swallowed but maintained eye contact. "I'm not suggesting we believe in curses, but come on. It's obviously old and well-preserved. Maybe it has some legitimate historical value." His attempt at a casual shrug didn't fully mask the gleam in his eyes. The tension between practical skepticism and the potential for profit had started to shape a new conflict. Brenda caught that spark and frowned, her apprehension deepening. The last thing she wanted was for Nick to ignore any inherent danger because dollar signs danced in his imagination. Larry cleared his throat, hesitant to stoke the flames of any argument. "I can't say for certain what it's worth," he admitted, though he didn't dismiss Nick's idea outright. Artifacts of unknown origin can fetch a price, especially if they're tied to famous stories. But the real question is how you want to deal with something that might be more than just a curiosity. Brenda spoke up, her voice strained. "What do you mean, might be more?" she asked, her eyes darting to the paw as if it might leap off the table. Larry avoided a direct reply, though his expression was grim. "I've studied enough folklore and superstition to know that even if the stories aren't literally true, they often spring from real events. Maybe someone believed in it enough to do something terrible." The hush that followed was interrupted only by the slow, steady rhythm of rainfall against the windows. Nick exchanged a look with Brenda, who pressed her lips into a firm line. She asked Larry if he had personally encountered anything like this before. Larry shook his head, admitting that while he'd come across oddities, like deformed animal parts or cryptid hoaxes, this was a new level of unsettling. A subtle weight settled over them, an unspoken realization that they might be holding something best left undiscovered. Even so, Nick's thoughts drifted back to the notion that the paw could be valuable, either to a collector or perhaps a museum specializing in the bizarre. He tried to rationalize, reminding himself that it was just an object, incapable of harm in and of itself. Brenda, meanwhile, felt the tension in her chest grow with every passing moment. She recalled how the night before, she had barely slept, haunted by half-formed nightmares of twisted fingers and silent pleas for help. Now, hearing Larry mention how the paw might be associated with real tragedy, her discomfort soared. She could almost sense a malignant presence within that curled hand. It was not simply an old piece of leather. It radiated a quiet menace that set her nerves on edge. The children, picking up on the mood, remained uncharacteristically silent, perched near the edge of the hallway, eyes reflecting the hush of dread that settled around the adults. Larry folded his gloves carefully and placed them on his lap, leaning forward in his seat. His voice was softer when he began to speak of the 1902 story he had come across in his research. It involved a father who used the paw to resurrect his dead son, only to discover the boy was horribly maimed and suffering. That final wish, to end his child's pain, echoed through the rumor mill as the reason the paw was buried and never seen again. It was said to carry a trickster's curse, twisting hopes into nightmares. Though Larry didn't press the gory details, the blunt edges of the tale were enough to coil a new wave of revulsion in Brenda's stomach. She rubbed her arms, as if trying to banish goosebumps. Nick let out a shaky breath, trying to appear cool-headed. "Urban legends," he said, yet the old confidence in his voice was missing. He took the paw back from Larry, examining it himself. Even behind the seal of the plastic bag, it felt uncomfortably close, like a predator just beyond glass. "I'm not about to buy into ghost stories," he insisted, though he said it almost for his own benefit. Brenda stiffened. "Then what do you plan to do with it?" she asked, glancing between her husband and the ominous shape within the bag. Nick hesitated, then admitted that maybe they should show it to someone with expertise in historical artifacts. "There might be a market for this kind of thing," he added, a bit too casually. Brenda's eyes flashed with concern, and even Larry's expression darkened. "I don't recommend parading it around," Larry cautioned, voice grim. "It might attract the wrong kind of attention." His words were gentle, but the implication was clear. He had known cases where the bizarre or taboo had drawn unscrupulous individuals eager to exploit or study such relics for dark reasons. "Not to mention," he said, "if this is truly the paw from the stories, do you want to risk seeing what happens if it falls into the wrong hands?" A flicker of lightning brightened the window, followed shortly by a soft roll of thunder. The sound made everyone look up, as though an external force punctuated Larry's warning. Brenda nodded, swallowing her anxiety. "He's right," she murmured. "We should just get rid—" She paused, catching herself, because Nick's brow furrowed at the suggestion. She remembered how earlier she wanted to cast it away as far as possible. The kids, from their vantage point, could almost feel the tension thickening like humidity before a storm. Lisa reflexively clutched Sam's hand, unsettled by the idea that her parents were at odds over this thing. Sam's eyes flicked anxiously between the living room and the partially hidden shape of the paw, as if expecting it to twitch. Nick tried to keep his frustration in check. "We shouldn't do anything drastic," he said, aiming a reassuring smile at Brenda that came off more as a grimace. "I'm not saying I don't believe the old stories have some grain of truth, but come on, we're not living in a penny dreadful." He aimed a glance at Larry, who responded with a slow shrug, the corners of his mouth dipped in worry. Larry repeated that it was wise to be cautious, superstitions or not. Nick's skepticism and Brenda's anxiety formed a taut push and pull that hung in the air, each uncertain which stance the other would ultimately take. The fact remained that a bizarre, potentially cursed item now lay in their living room. Brenda pressed her lips together, feeling as though she stood on the precipice of a steep drop. The rational part of her mind told her that this was merely an old artifact, decaying flesh and hair, nothing more. But another part, the part that remembered her nightmares, insisted that, true or not, the legend had a weight that should not be ignored. She pictured Lisa and Sam unearthing this thing, shaking dirt off its awful shape, and felt a pang of guilt. Had she and Nick failed to protect their children from something dreadful? Outside, thunder rumbled again, reverberating through the house, almost like a voice of warning. Larry recognized that the situation called for a delicate approach. Removing the paw from the premises without Nick's consent might only create more conflict. Instead, he suggested a thorough documentation: photographs, measurements, material analysis. "At least gather as much data as we can," he said, trying to offer a logical solution. "If you decide to show it to an antiques appraiser or a historian, you'll have something prepared." Nick nodded, relieved to have a plan that didn't involve discarding an item he suspected might have considerable worth. Brenda, on the other hand, looked troubled, but she managed a small nod. If nothing else, they needed more facts. A hush fell. Rain pattered heavily against the windows as the storm gathered outside. Larry began rummaging in his duffel bag, producing a notepad, a small camera, and a portable scale. He wore a subdued expression that matched the ominous mood in the house. Before he set to work, he cast another concerned glance at Brenda. "I'm not trying to alarm anyone," he said quietly, "but there are too many coincidences here. The rumor of that 1902 story, the location, and now this paw turning up." She swallowed hard, her eyes darting to the silhouette of the mummified object. "I just want my family to be safe," she murmured, almost under her breath, an ache resonating in her tone. Nick hovered as Larry photographed the paw from multiple angles. Despite his earlier bravado, he felt a dull knot forming in his stomach. Something about Larry's serious approach forced him to confront the possibility that this object was no ordinary relic. He forced down the urge to crack a joke or wave off the tension. The camera's shutter clicks amplified the heaviness of the moment, each flash capturing the paw's withered digits in stark detail. At one point, Lisa and Sam inched closer, mesmerized by the procedure. Their innocence, reflected in wide eyes, reminded Nick of why he had to remain practical and calm. He didn't want to burden them with ghost stories, or worse, let them suspect how deeply unsettled he truly felt. When Larry finished documenting the paw's appearance, he placed it on the scale to note its weight. He muttered the reading under his breath, then jotted it down. Finally, he performed a cursory examination of the texture, though he refrained from removing it from the sealed bag to avoid contamination. "It's surprisingly intact for something that's presumably well over 100 years old," he remarked softly. "And it isn't freeze-dried or encased in resin. It looks, well, unnaturally preserved." The phrase "unnaturally preserved" made Brenda close her eyes for a heartbeat, wishing she could unhear it. Larry went on, describing how certain environmental conditions might delay decay, but the explanation felt thin even to him. Nick placed a hand on Larry's shoulder. "Thanks for doing this," he said, voice subdued. Brenda only nodded, a flicker of relief that at least they were approaching the situation systematically. The storm outside intensified, lightning illuminating the windows, thunder rolling in waves. It lent the living room a surreal atmosphere, as though nature itself underscored the strangeness within. Larry packed his items away, glancing from Nick to Brenda and then at the children, who stood quietly to one side. "I have to say," he confessed, "this is one of the strangest things I've encountered. I'm not sure whether to be fascinated or concerned." Brenda's eyes shone with apprehension. She broke into the conversation by suggesting that maybe they should store the paw somewhere away from the family's living spaces, put it in the garage or a locked cabinet. Nick regarded her for a moment, then nodded. "All right," he agreed. "Just for peace of mind." His tone wavered, caught between placating Brenda's fears and protecting his own sense of control. He hated feeling like some superstitious fool, yet each new piece of information eroded his confidence a little more. Larry helped secure the paw back into its makeshift container, offering no further argument. After all, the paw's influence, real or imagined, had grown unmistakable. Once the box was sealed and set aside, the tension in the room diminished marginally, though it did not vanish. Everyone seemed to breathe a little easier without the paw in plain sight. Larry glanced at his watch, frowning at how much time had passed. The storm still raged outside, sheets of rain making visibility poor. Brenda offered him a cup of coffee, which he accepted gratefully, and they moved to the kitchen for a slight change of scene. Lisa and Sam followed at a distance, still uncharacteristically quiet. The children's presence added a note of family warmth that contrasted sharply with the undercurrent of unease. Over steaming mugs of coffee, conversation drifted to safer topics. Larry's recent work identifying rare species of lizards, Nick's job at a local marketing firm, Brenda's volunteer efforts with a community program. Yet none of them could erase from their minds the shriveled relic waiting in the next room. The glow of the kitchen light was comforting, but it felt fragile, like a candle flame in a drafty corridor. Larry mentioned how important it was to remain rational, to gather more information before jumping to any conclusions. Brenda nodded dutifully, but that nagging sense of doom tugged at her mind. She kept recalling each detail of the curse legend, the father burying the paw, the heartbreak that followed. Nick tried once again to reassure everyone, though a note of forced levity crept into his jokes. He said something about how they'd soon look back on this as a weird anecdote, perhaps even make a few dollars if they found the right buyer. Brenda gave him a warning look, her fear tempered by frustration. He noticed her expression and sighed. Fine, he relented. Maybe we should hold off on any big decisions. Just gather facts. Larry sipped his coffee and stared down at the cup, absorbing the tension between them. Sometimes, he said gently, folklore leaves a stronger mark than people realize. His words made Brenda's eyes wander toward the living room, imagining that paw stirring, forging new nightmares for an unsuspecting family. Thunder boomed again, closer than before, rattling a few dishes in the sink. Lisa and Sam both jumped, and Brenda ushered them into the hallway, trying to be comforting. It's all right, she murmured, but her gaze flicked back to Nick, who offered a thin smile. The children asked if they should go to their rooms, and Brenda nodded. Sam shot his father a look that seemed to ask for reassurance, but Nick only gave an awkward shrug. Lisa took Sam's hand, and they ascended the stairs, leaving the grown-ups to grapple with their own mounting uncertainties. The subdued patter of their footsteps disappeared. Larry set his empty mug on the counter, letting out a quiet sigh. His curiosity about the paw had been partially satisfied, but a new wariness had taken its place. Something about the object's presence and the swirling stories of curses made it hard to shrug off as mere legend. Nick walked him back to the front door, where Larry paused. I don't want to feed into superstitions, he told Nick, but I think you should keep an eye on that paw and how it's affecting your family. The mind can do strange things. Nick nodded, faintly relieved that Larry kept it grounded in psychological terms. Still, the mention of how it might affect the family lingered ominously. It was as if the paw had an agency all its own, warping emotions and stirring shadows in every corner of the house. When Larry stepped outside, the rain pummeled him, and he dashed for his car. Nick remained under the porch overhang, watching his friend drive off into the storm. For a long moment, he stood there, letting the thunder echo across the rooftops. In the dim glare of the porch light, rivulets of water streaming from the gutter, he felt more alone than ever. He was left with the realization that the paw, and the unsettled sense of potential doom, was now his burden to manage. He swallowed the knot in his throat, turned back into the house, and locked the door behind him. Lightning flickered, momentarily illuminating the silhouette of the living room furniture, making him jump. Inside, Brenda waited, arms folded, a single lamp casting warm light across her face. She studied her husband's expression, searching for some sign of confidence. Instead, she saw a flicker of unease that mirrored her own. We'll figure this out, Nick said, his voice quiet. Brenda managed a small nod, but anxiety coursed through her. She imagined the paw in its box, as though it had ears to hear their every word. Silly as the thought might be, it gripped her imagination with fierce tenacity. Before she could voice her feelings, Nick brushed a hand along her shoulder in a gesture of comfort. Let's get some rest, he said softly, though neither of them believed real rest would come easily. They headed upstairs, the storm's thunder still reverberating outside. In their bedroom, the shadows on the walls seemed unnaturally deep, as though eager to conceal something unwelcome. Brenda changed into her nightclothes, thoughts circling around the dreaded notion that maybe legends sometimes hold a kernel of truth. Nick lingered by the window, parted the curtains, and watched the restless night sky. For a second, he thought he saw movement near the fence line behind their house, but a flash of lightning showed only wind-blown branches swaying. Shaking his head, he stepped away. The tension refused to dissipate, and he wondered if his mind was playing tricks on him. Down the hall, Lisa and Sam lay in their rooms, each quietly mulling over everything they'd overheard. Lisa's imagination wandered, conjuring images of ghostly shapes drifting through the yard, while Sam found himself unable to shake the memory of that leathery paw. Every so often, a bolt of lightning illuminated the cracks under their doors, and each time they braced for a new jolt of thunder. The word curse rang in their minds, though they scarcely understood its gravity. They could only sense that something cold and fearsome had entered their home, and they wanted it gone. Morning arrived with overcast skies and damp pavement. Nick rose early to check on the paw, stifling a flicker of apprehension as he approached the locked cabinet in the garage where he had placed it overnight. The box was just as he'd left it, silent and seemingly inert. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that its presence overshadowed the normalcy of the morning routine. Brenda prepared breakfast with absent motions, her eyes darting from the sink to the window as if expecting an omen to appear in the yard. The children descended the stairs with forced smiles, each trying to be brave in the face of an unspoken dread. Nick glanced at his phone, noticing a message from Larry, who had texted to say he'd managed to compile some references to old newspapers that might prove helpful. For a fleeting moment, Nick felt relief. Maybe if they uncovered the real story behind the paw, it would lift the claustrophobic tension. He placed a hand on Brenda's shoulder, hoping to share the slight encouragement. She nodded but said nothing. The weight of possibility pressed on them both. Maybe the paw was simply an odd relic, and once they understood its history, they could put it behind them. Or perhaps the intangible fear clinging to the house was justified, and the paw truly was something monstrous in disguise. Over breakfast, Nick and Brenda spoke softly, deciding that they would spend the day sifting through whatever records Larry had found. They kept the conversation light around the children, focusing on reassuring them that everything was under control. "We'll sort this out," Nick said again, forcing conviction into his voice. He also mentioned that the paw would stay locked away. To that, Lisa's shoulders relaxed a bit, though Sam still wore a look of quiet apprehension. Neither child asked the obvious question: could the paw do anything on its own? The storm had dissipated overnight, leaving the sky heavy with gray clouds, but withholding further rain. A slight breeze stirred the trees in the backyard, a damp hush enveloping the neighborhood. Brenda tried to carry on with her usual tasks, answering emails, folding laundry, but her thoughts remained fixed on the paw. She found herself standing by the window, gazing at the patch of yard where Lisa and Sam had dug up the relic. The earth had been filled in, but the grass was still churned up. No matter how she told herself to dismiss it, the sense of a disturbed resting place lingered in her mind. Nick retreated to his study, where he called Larry and discussed the possibility of contacting a local historian. He admitted he was torn between seeking expert advice and avoiding sensationalizing the paw. Larry pointed out that if any local archives mentioned a strange artifact from the early 20th century, it would likely surface in old newspaper clippings or genealogical records. Nick jotted down everything Larry suggested, keeping his voice low as if someone might overhear. He felt a slight thrill of detective work, hoping facts would triumph over fear. Yet, at the edges of his consciousness, doubts gnawed persistently. By afternoon, the children had resumed more typical activities, watching a cartoon, attempting homework, though their laughter felt forced. Brenda took a moment to explain again that the paw was safely locked away. She assured them that Larry, who knew a lot about wild animals and strange relics, would help solve this mystery. Lisa pretended to be satisfied by that explanation, but a flicker in her eyes betrayed lingering unease. Sam merely nodded, hugging a small stuffed toy as though warding off invisible spirits. Brenda's chest tightened at the sight. She resolved to keep the family together, no matter what, even if it meant confronting her own fears about the paw. Nick emerged from his study, armed with a notebook of potential leads. He offered Brenda a small, uncertain smile. "There might be a local archive we can visit," he said. "I can schedule a meeting, maybe tomorrow, to dig through some old records." Brenda nodded, grateful for a proactive plan, though her stomach churned with each mention of the paw's possible connection to tragic legends. She couldn't banish from her mind the image of a grief-stricken father burying it deep in the forest over a century ago. The notion that her children had stumbled upon it, resurrecting an old nightmare, weighed heavily on her. The day dragged on, punctuated by half-finished tasks and uneasy silences. Every so often, the phone buzzed, but it was never a direct answer to their predicament, just telemarketers or mundane updates. The hours extended, each one thick with the unspoken sense that they were living alongside something they did not fully understand. As evening approached, Brenda realized she had barely eaten. The kids picked at their dinner, while Nick methodically checked the lock on the cabinet containing the paw. They agreed to try for an earlier bedtime, hoping some measure of rest would help. Before heading upstairs, Brenda paused by the garage door, listening to the faint hum of the house's electrical current and the soft drip of water from a leaky spigot. She exhaled shakily, recalling Larry's final words as he left. Be cautious with this. Sometimes believing is enough to bring out the worst in people or objects. She closed her eyes briefly, imagining the paw slumbering in that cabinet, harboring secrets that might tear apart their sense of safety. Her heart pounded as she forced herself to walk back into the house. Even if she wanted to rid themselves of it, Nick's reluctance posed a significant hurdle. Upstairs, the corridor was quiet, a few stray shadows cast by nightlights. Nick lingered near the bedroom door, glancing down at Lisa's and Sam's closed rooms. He still felt the pull of skepticism, insisting to himself that the curse was nothing but folklore. Yet each time he pictured that withered hand, doubt resurfaced. Brenda joined him, a silent question in her eyes. He nodded, guiding her into their bedroom. Once inside, they spoke in hushed tones about the next steps, visiting archives, staying in touch with Larry, maybe contacting a museum if they found something conclusive. At last, with the day's tension weighing heavily, they sank into bed, neither expecting actual sleep to come easily. Midnight found Brenda lying awake, hearing every small noise, the water heater clicking, the tree branches scraping gently outside. She pictured the paw in its box, remembered Larry's warning about the 1902 father who had tried to outwit fate, and closed her eyes against a surge of dread. Nick stirred beside her, but did not wake. In the darkness, Brenda reached for his hand, as if seeking reassurance. She told herself that tomorrow they would make real progress in understanding this relic and dispelling the gloom it had cast over their lives. Yet a tiny, persistent voice within whispered that knowledge alone might not be enough. Down the hall, Lisa dreamed fitfully of unearthing endless relics, each more horrifying than the last. Sam, meanwhile, trembled at every groan of the house, imagining the paw creeping about. Beneath the roof of the Thompson family, the night deepened, and so did the sense of foreboding. They had only begun to uncover the monkey's paw's ancient and unsettling legacy. Though they strove to remain grounded in practicality, treating it as a piece of history, a collectible, or a curio, the seeds of fear were planted. With Larry's warnings echoing in their minds, they braced themselves for whatever truth they might discover, never fully admitting how close they felt to the creeping shadow of an age-old curse. Part 3. Attempted Destruction and Growing Belief. Brenda lay wide awake, her gaze fixed on the faint outline of the bedroom ceiling. The night was oppressively quiet, yet her thoughts roiled with growing unease. She could almost feel the monkey's paw throbbing somewhere in the house, even though it was locked away, sealed in a box that Nick had insisted was secure. But those measures did nothing for her peace of mind. Each time she closed her eyes, the afterimage of the paw seemed to dance in the darkness, a distorted silhouette with long, macabre fingers. She told herself it was only stress, only her imagination, but the dread refused to subside. She turned to look at Nick, who slept in fitful bouts. He'd spent the earlier part of the evening combing through old newspaper clippings and online records, chasing the faintest traces of that chilling 1902 legend. Though Nick tried to appear rational, Brenda could see the changes in him. The fractured glances, the restless pacing, the way his voice faltered when speaking of the paw. It unnerved her to think that the man who once scoffed at any notion of curses now walked on eggshells around an inanimate object. Or perhaps it was not inanimate at all, a thought she banished the moment it surfaced. She rose quietly, smoothing down the blanket so as not to wake him. The silence of the hallway enveloped her, broken only by the soft hum of the refrigerator downstairs and the occasional groan of the house settling in the night. Every floorboard she stepped on seemed to protest, a subtle creak that made her flinch. She had decided, in that moment, to do what Nick was unwilling to do: rid their home of the paw once and for all. Whether or not it was truly cursed, Brenda could not deny the malevolent aura it exuded. She was certain the family would be safer if it was destroyed. Her heart pounded as she descended the stairs. She eased open the door to the garage, where the box lay hidden on a high shelf behind a row of paint cans. She found the overhead light and flicked it on. A dull glow revealed the cluttered space: Nick's workbench, a stack of old tools, cardboard boxes labeled with scribbled words in black marker. The air was faintly chilly, tinged with the smell of dust and concrete. She didn't dare hesitate. If she stood there thinking too long, her nerve might falter. She carefully lifted the box down, feeling the weight of the paw within. It seemed heavier than she remembered. Brenda clutched the box tightly, her palms clammy. The lock Nick had placed on it was simple enough, a clasp secured by a small padlock. She fished out the spare key from her robe pocket. Opening it felt like a betrayal, but her instincts screamed that leaving the paw intact was the greater betrayal, one against her family's safety. With trembling hands, she removed the lock, flipped open the lid, and pulled out the sealed bag. Even through the plastic, the paw looked grotesque, an aged, leathery appendage, each finger curled slightly, as though beckoning the unwary. She thought she saw a faint reflection in the window, her own face, contorted by apprehension, with that hideous object in her hands. She removed the paw from the bag, then laid the plastic aside on the workbench. The paw felt cold, yet oddly rigid. Her entire being revolted at the tactile sensation, as if she held something alive and malicious. She whispered a brief apology to Nick, to the children, to anyone who might have believed they needed to study or keep this relic. She just wanted it gone. With a determined exhale, she returned inside, tiptoeing past the living room where a sliver of moonlight cut through drawn curtains. In the kitchen, shadows cast by the sparse streetlight outside formed strange shapes across the linoleum floor. She knew exactly what to do. The garbage disposal in the sink was robust. She'd seen it grind through tough vegetable peels and even small bones. It was the only method that made sense in the dead of night. She did not trust that a hammer, or even a fire, could truly annihilate the paw. She intended to shred it into bits, flush it down the drain, and be rid of it forever. Each step resonated with her growing desperation. She flicked on the small lamp above the sink. The metal basin gleamed, a polished mouth waiting to devour anything in its path. Her breath quivered as she reached for the switch to the disposal, a stuttering fear telling her this was madness. But she recalled Lisa's and Sam's frightened faces, the nightmares, the palpable tension that had infected the family ever since the paw appeared. With renewed resolve, she dropped the cursed relic into the drain. It landed with a soft thump, wedged momentarily in the darkness below. She flipped the switch. The disposal roared to life, a mechanical rumble that reverberated through the silent house. At once, the blades churned, protesting with shrieks of metal on bone, or whatever the paw was made of. Brenda's eyes clamped shut, bracing herself. For a few seconds, the awful grinding noise seemed to escalate, and she felt a rush of grim satisfaction. Then, abruptly, something snagged. The sound changed from churning to sputtering. The disposal whined as if it had collided with an immovable object. She froze in terror. She flipped the switch off, her pulse thundering so loud she could barely think. Cautiously, she turned it on again, hoping she had just jammed it. The disposal whirred, sputtered, and then let out a shriek that jolted her heart. She gasped, nearly stumbling backward. It was as though the paw was too tough, too resistant for the blades to break. She hesitated only a moment before reaching for a wooden spoon, attempting to push the paw deeper. The instant the disposal resumed, the nightmarish shrieking returned, followed by a dull clang that sounded like metal teeth snapping uselessly against steel. Brenda switched it off yet again, panting. A surge of utter dread engulfed her. She could scarcely believe that a piece of old flesh and bone would prove immune to such force, unless it was truly cursed. The room spun. In her haste, she fumbled with the spoon, nearly dropping it. She was about to try again, to force it until the disposal either broke or consumed the paw, when the overhead light flicked on. She whirled around, and there stood Nick, hair tousled, eyes wide with alarm. "Brenda?" he managed, voice thick with sleep and confusion. "What are you... Why is the disposal running?" She turned away, frantic and overwhelmed. "I have to destroy it," she said, her voice trembling. "Nick, we can't keep it. It needs to be gone. It won't..." She broke off, choking on her words as tears pooled in her eyes. Nick took a hesitant step forward, glimpsing the handle of the wooden spoon protruding from the drain, along with the gnarled outline of that wretched paw stuck part way. A flicker of disbelief crossed his face. Realizing the full extent of her desperation, he lunged for the switch, shutting off the disposal once more. For several heartbeats, they stood in silence, the sink gurgling as water trickled down the partially clogged drain. Brenda backed away, trembling. "I can't destroy it," she whispered, voice ragged. Nick stared at the paw, battered yet seemingly intact. His skepticism crumbled. He had not believed the paw could hold such supernatural resilience. Yet here it was, resisting the sharp blades of a steel disposal. He slowly reached for the spoon, cautious as though the paw might lash out at him. The wooden handle slipped in his grip, and he accidentally nudged the paw. It tilted, but remained unscathed. Brenda sank into a nearby chair, burying her face in her hands. She half expected Nick to scold her or express anger at her unilateral decision. Instead, he seemed shell-shocked. "You could have hurt yourself," he finally said, but his tone was gentle, suffused with an undercurrent of mounting fear. She glanced up. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice quivering. "I just couldn't bear another moment, waiting for it to do something." Nick exhaled, raking a hand through his hair. Wordlessly, he bent down, pulled on the rubber dishwashing gloves that sat on the counter, and gingerly pried the paw from the drain. It was only then that Brenda noticed small nicks on the paw's leathery hide, likely from where the disposal's blades had made contact. Yet it had suffered no real damage. No loose threads of flesh, no shredded fur. It looked as foul and intact as when she first placed it in the sink. The disposal itself was another matter. There was a jarring squeal when Nick tried running it without the paw, and he had to switch it off immediately. They both realized the apparatus was either jammed or broken. The paw had, quite literally, defeated the machine designed to obliterate waste. Nick straightened. His breath came in short bursts, eyes darting from the mangled disposal to the paw in his gloved hand. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was Brenda's ragged breathing and the faint drip of water leaking from the sink. At last, Nick broke the silence. "This thing, it's real," he muttered, as though speaking to himself. "Somehow it's not just an old relic. He stopped, unable or unwilling to finish the thought. Brenda rose shakily to her feet and approached him, her expression equal parts relief and terror. Relief that he finally believed. Terror because that belief confirmed all her worst suspicions. He guided her gently out of the kitchen, toward the living room, wanting to place the paw out of sight. She refused to touch it, so he carried it himself, still wrapped in the gloves, and laid it on a folded towel atop the coffee table. They didn't bother returning it to the garage or the box. Something told them that would be meaningless, a flimsy gesture against the paw's intangible power. The overhead lamp cast a dim circle of light, creating macabre shadows on the wall. Brenda shuddered, rubbing her arms. She felt an awful awareness, a certainty that they were dealing with forces beyond normal reason. Nick retrieved a blanket from the couch and draped it around her shoulders. "Let me handle this," he whispered, though his voice trembled. "I'm sorry I didn't listen." She nodded, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. She glanced at the paw, half expecting it to twitch. Her heart pounded so violently she thought it might bruise her ribcage. Taking a steadying breath, she confessed how she'd lain awake, tormented by the sense that the paw was somehow alive in its malevolence. Nick's expression flickered with sympathy. His own fear mirrored hers, though he tried to cloak it in a veneer of calm. They stayed like that for several long minutes, side by side on the couch, gazing at the monstrosity on the table. Eventually Nick stood, his eyes glowing with new resolve. "I need to know everything," he said, almost under his breath. "Clearly it can't be destroyed by normal means. If the legends are true, then—" He trailed off, but Brenda understood. He meant the rumors of wishes that came at a dreadful cost. A weight settled on her shoulders, for she sensed that Nick was about to embark on a course of action she dreaded. She wanted nothing more than to fling the paw into a furnace, bury it, do anything to remove it from their lives. But Nick, having realized its power, could not simply dismiss the possibility that its magic was real. He headed to the study, Brenda following like a nervous shadow. The quiet hall felt too narrow, suffocating. Once inside, Nick perched at his desk, flicking on a single lamp. The messy sprawl of papers, notes, and old clippings from libraries and online databases cluttered every surface. Here were old photos, grainy newspaper scans, and half-legible quotes referencing the father who had buried the paw long ago. Brenda stood behind him, unsure whether to urge him to stop or encourage him to learn more. She settled for watching him sift through the documents. Nick found the folder containing the scant bits of evidence he'd pieced together. One clipping, from an early 20th century tabloid, mentioned a man who claimed a severed monkey's paw granted 3 wishes. Another, from a local historical journal, hinted at a grief-stricken father burying something cursed in the woods. Nick had been skeptical before, chalking it up to sensational lore. But tonight, after witnessing the paw repel the garbage disposal, he had no room left for doubt. He read each line aloud, voice trembling with excitement and dread. Brenda listened, hugging herself. She realized that she'd only half attended to Nick's earlier research, brushing it off as fruitless. Now, every phrase gained new weight. The articles spoke of fortunes won and lost, of unnatural resurrections, of tragedies culminating in the final, desperate wish. Nothing was conclusive, yet each snippet painted the same picture, a cursed artifact that perverted any wish into something horrifying. Nick switched tabs on his laptop, scanning digital archives. Brenda heard the muted click of keys as he searched for new references, anything to confirm that this paw could indeed be the same one. At last, he stumbled upon a half-forgotten blog post, written years ago by a local historian who referenced a peculiar hand rumored to have been buried in the Pinewood region. The historian described the object as indestructible, citing an anecdote of failed attempts to burn or crush it. Brenda's breath caught in her throat. She recalled the disposal scene in excruciating detail, the shrieking metal blades, the paw's undamaged flesh. Nick leaned back in his chair, eyes haunted. "It matches everything," he said, voice cracking. "That father, he lost his son in a machine accident, just like the articles said. He used the paw to bring him back, only to see him return in some terrible state. Then he used the final wish to—" Brenda laid a hand on Nick's shoulder, feeling his muscles tense. "We don't know if it's all true," she offered weakly, but the look he gave her told her otherwise. He rose abruptly, the intensity in his eyes sharper than she had ever seen. He paced the room, running a hand over his face. "What if we can—" he began, then stopped, glancing at Brenda as if she might recoil. She did. He was obviously thinking about the power of the paw, the potential to command it in some way. Her stomach twisted. "Nick, no," she whispered, the words almost inaudible. "We can't. This thing, it's evil, isn't it? Or cursed, or it'll twist anything we ask." Her voice shook, recalling the legend, the father's sorrow, the unimaginable horror of seeing a mangled loved one returned from the grave. Nick grimaced, torn between fear and a desperate, budding conviction. He abruptly left the study, Brenda hurrying after him. In the living room, the paw still rested on the coffee table like a grotesque centerpiece. Nick stared at it, jaw clenched. "If it can grant wishes," he said, "maybe there's a way to outsmart it. Formulate them carefully. Avoid any loopholes." Brenda listened, aghast. She remembered how only an hour earlier she'd been frantic to destroy the paw. Even now, the sight of it filled her with revulsion. Yet Nick stood there, mesmerized, speaking of exploiting its power while evading the tragedy that befell its previous owners. She opened her mouth to protest, but the words wouldn't come. A memory of the disposal fiasco flashed in her mind. She didn't know how to fight an object that seemed impervious to physical harm. If Nick was bent on uncovering the paw's secrets, what could she say? She bit her lip, tears pooling in her eyes again. "You saw what it did," she managed at last, voice trembling. "We can't just treat it like a magic lamp. The stories—" "I know the stories," Nick shot back, anguish twisting his features. But they all had one thing in common: mistakes in how the wishes were phrased. What if we— He halted, pressing his lips together. His eyes slid away from hers, as though he realized how insane it sounded. "I just can't stand not trying," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "If it's truly unstoppable, we at least need to understand how it works, or we'll live in fear forever." She wanted to tell him that the risk was too high, that they could simply bury it again, but the memory of how easily Lisa and Sam had found it made her shudder. Burying it once hadn't kept it hidden forever. She slumped onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. A swirl of hopelessness and resignation filled her. On one hand, she wanted to flee, to take the children and run far from this cursed thing. On the other, she recognized that Nick was right. They needed answers. The paw, once awakened, might defy any simple attempt to discard it. The cynic in her realized that some part of Nick also found the idea of harnessing the paw's power enticing. Even though he feared it, a faint ambition glimmered in his eyes. Was it greed, or desperation, or just a desire to conquer the unknown? He crouched beside her, gently removing her hands from her face. "We'll figure out a plan," he said, trying to be soothing. She could only shake her head, tears sliding down her cheeks. "I don't want our children hurt," she whispered, voice cracking. His grip on her hands tightened. "That's the last thing I want," he said, sincerity etched in every syllable. "Which is why we have to be careful. We'll take our time, figure out the safe approach. If we can't destroy it, we have to make sure it can't destroy us." The first hint of dawnlight filtered through the blinds, casting pale stripes across the furniture. They realized they had stayed awake the entire night, the adrenaline surge easing into a drawn-out, hollow fatigue. The paw sat in the open, as though mocking them. Brenda stared at it, her resolve in tatters. She recalled the father's tragedy from 1902, how he must have believed he could undo his loss, only to pay an even steeper price. She wondered if they were following his footsteps. Nick placed a hand on her shoulder, squeezing gently in unspoken reassurance. Morning brought little relief. Lisa and Sam woke to find their parents gaunt and exhausted, the tension in the air more palpable than ever. Nick forced a smile, but his voice was hoarse. Brenda tried to shoo the children away from the living room, not wanting them to see the paw exposed. When Sam caught a glimpse of it, he turned pale, recalling the nightmares that had dogged him since the day they unearthed it. "Why is it out?" he asked, voice trembling. Brenda muttered something about needing to examine it, reassuring him that everything was under control. But control was an illusion, and they all sensed it. Nick retreated to the study again, rummaging through the notes he'd compiled, as if the answer might leap out at him from some dusty historical reference. Brenda busied herself in the kitchen, avoiding the destroyed garbage disposal and dreading the plumbing repair they'd need to arrange. She tried to prepare breakfast, but her hands shook so badly she nearly dropped the eggs. Lisa hovered beside her, offering to help, though it was clear the child only sought comfort in the normalcy of cooking. At one point, Brenda found Nick reading a collection of rumored safe wishes, gleaned from various superstitious sources on the internet, posts by anonymous individuals claiming to have cheated curses by selecting their words with microscopic care. She wanted to rip the pages from his hands, to scream that no wish was worth gambling their lives. Instead, she settled for pleading with him, tears in her eyes, to consider the risk. Nick only nodded stiffly. "I won't do anything rash," he promised. "But we have to keep open minds. We can't live in terror." Evening returned, the day having crawled by in a haze of dread. The children retreated to their rooms, unnerved by the tension, but resigned to the grown-up conflict they barely understood. Brenda and Nick found themselves face-to-face in the living room again, the paw silent on the coffee table. It looked unchanged, defiant of time and natural decay. Brenda moved closer and asked, in a halting voice, what Nick intended to do. He spoke carefully, as though forging each sentence in the crucible of his racing thoughts. He recounted a half-formed plan to articulate wishes that left no room for tragic interpretation. Brenda stared at him, tears threatening once more. She saw the flicker of determination in his eyes, a willingness to wrestle with the malevolent force. She also saw fear, so profound that it had altered him. He was no longer the dismissive skeptic. He believed, and that belief had burdened him with a grim sense of necessity. "We can't let it rule us," he insisted softly. "We have to make it safe, or destroy it somehow, since destroying it didn't work." He trailed off, letting the implication stand. If they couldn't destroy the paw, they would need to outsmart it. Brenda felt a wave of dizziness. She recalled the shriek of the disposal, the paw emerging unscathed, and realized how hopeless it all sounded. Yet Nick's new conviction gave her a strange sliver of hope. He had always been resourceful, clever. Maybe, if anyone could find a loophole, it was him. Still, the legends promised only heartbreak to those who meddled with the paw. She reminded him that they had not read a single positive outcome in all those recorded stories. Nick conceded that point, but insisted perhaps no one had tried hard enough to craft the perfect wish. They were at an impasse. The household moved under a cloud of looming dread. Late that night, after they tucked Lisa and Sam into bed, Nick and Brenda lingered by the living room window. The moon was high, bathing the neighborhood in an eerie silver. The paw lay in plain sight, a constant reminder of their predicament. Brenda felt Nick's arm snake around her shoulder, pulling her close. "I'm sorry," he murmured, pressing his cheek to her hair. "I didn't want to believe any of this, but now we have to do something." She nodded, eyes moist. Every fiber of her being wanted to scream at him to bury it again or hurl it off a cliff. But she knew, logically, that such measures might only postpone the inevitable. The father in 1902 had tried to bury it in the wilderness, and it had still found its way into their yard over a century later. Something in the paw sought out those susceptible to its influence, or perhaps it thrived on chance. Either way, it was here, and ignoring it would accomplish nothing. Nick gently turned her to face him. His voice was resolute yet tinged with desperation. "I promise I'll protect us," he said. "I'll figure out a way to do this that won't hurt anyone." I swear Brenda's heart twisted. She could see in his expression that he truly meant it. The question was whether the paw, with all its rumored curse, would allow such a maneuver. She opened her mouth to beg him not to try, but the words caught. Deep down, a kernel of curiosity also flickered in her. The damage was done. They were already tangled with the paw. Maybe if Nick could harness it safely, they could end this nightmare. She lowered her gaze, pressing her forehead against his chest. "Don't let it destroy us," she whispered. He held her, breathing in the faint scent of her shampoo, and nodded. The vow hung between them, unspoken and solemn. Outside, the moon drifted behind a cloud. Shadows crept across the windowsill, as if the night itself recognized the gravity of what they contemplated. They slept restlessly, haunted by swirling dreams. Brenda relived the disposal scene over and over, hearing the grating squeal and glimpsing flashes of the paw's unyielding form. Nick dreamed of pages of text that kept shifting and rearranging, never allowing him to find the perfect phrasing for a wish. By morning, they were both bleary-eyed and pale. The children noticed, but neither parent offered much explanation. Over a meager breakfast, Nick stared off into space, mentally rehearsing ways to phrase unstoppable desires without incurring monstrous twists. Brenda looked on, guilt warring with reluctant acceptance. The day passed in a blur of subdued chores and hushed conversations. Nick retreated to his study for hours at a time, scrawling notes and crossing them out. Brenda tried to distract Lisa and Sam, who sensed that something was deeply wrong. She told them everything would be all right, though she could hardly muster conviction. The paw remained on the coffee table, a silent witness to their growing desperation. Its presence weighed on the house like a lead blanket. Near sunset, Brenda found Nick in the living room, pacing back and forth with a sheet of paper in hand. It was covered in scribbles, phrases, corrections, elaborate disclaimers to ward off dire consequences. His face was drawn, eyes carrying the heaviness of someone wrestling with invisible demons. When he saw her, he gently folded the paper. "I think I've got a plan," he said, "but I need to refine it more. I won't rush." She nodded, relief and terror mingling in her heart. She could do nothing but trust him, though her instincts screamed at her that no plan would suffice against something so inherently malevolent. Anxiety reigned that evening, but Nick remained unshaken in his new resolve. In bed, he whispered reassurances to Brenda, promising he would not act impulsively. He spoke of writing out every possible wish scenario, running it through mental simulations to catch any potential for misinterpretation. He insisted they could beat the curse at its own game, and all the while, Brenda lay there gripping his hand, too tired to argue. She felt as though they had stepped onto a tightrope between rational strategy and foolish ambition. The final hour of that day found them in a tense silence, preparing to sleep while the paw lingered in the next room. Brenda's thoughts circled the question. If the paw truly was unstoppable, had they already lost? She could not banish images of that father from 1902, driven to extremes by grief. She remembered the old clippings describing the monstrous final outcome. Nick's plan might succeed where others failed, but it might also unleash horrors none of them could imagine. Still, there was no turning back. The paw was in their home, impervious to destruction, and the only option that remained was the one Nick had chosen, to outsmart the ancient curse. They turned off the lights, the entire house sinking into restless darkness. Outside, a mild wind rustled the trees. Inside, hush reigned, though the tension was as thick as ever. Lying in bed, Brenda stared at the ceiling once more, feeling Nick's heartbeat as she curled close to him. She understood, with sudden clarity, that whatever happened next would define their future, perhaps even their survival. They could not simply ignore the paw's power. They had tried to destroy it, and it had withstood them. Now Nick believed they had to use it, carefully, cunningly, or remain forever at its mercy. Sleep came in fractured intervals. In that twilight space between dreams and reality, Brenda heard the disposals shrieking, then saw Nick reaching for the paw. She dreamed of swirling blackness, of a silhouette that resembled her husband, but had glowing, haunted eyes, whispering that he had discovered the perfect wish. She jolted awake repeatedly, each time finding Nick's arm draped over her, warmth in his touch. By the time dawn's first light slipped through the window, she was exhausted, her nerves frayed beyond reason. Nick rose early, leaving the bedroom quietly so as not to wake her. She later found him in the living room, gazing at the paw with a new calm. It was the calm of a man who had made his choice. Brenda braced herself, unsure if she was comforted by his apparent confidence or terrified by the potential outcome. She didn't see the exact words he'd written in his notebook, nor did she ask for them. A fragile understanding bound them. He would finalize his strategy, and when the time came, he would make the wishes that he believed could circumvent the curse. For now, they said nothing more about it. The children stirred upstairs, and the normalcy of breakfast and chores beckoned. Yet, a throbbing awareness of the paw's presence underpinned everything they did. Brenda could not forget her attempt to annihilate it, nor the horrifying result. She had witnessed its indestructibility firsthand. Nick's meticulous planning was their new shield against the unknown. Perhaps, she told herself, some cunning arrangement of words could diffuse a curse. Hope was all she had left to cling to. For the rest of the day, they coexisted in uneasy harmony. Nick continued his research quietly, while Brenda tried to keep the household routine steady. The paw remained where it was, as though both of them were too afraid to touch it again. If the children asked, Brenda merely said that Mom and Dad were trying to figure out how to handle the strange relic, but that they shouldn't worry. Lisa and Sam nodded, though their eyes remained troubled. Night fell once more, the shadows lengthening across the floors and walls. Nick gathered his notes, placing them in a neat folder by his desk. He then went to Brenda and slipped his hand into hers. She could feel the tremor in his grip. "I'll do it," he said quietly. "Not tonight, but soon. I'm almost certain I can phrase everything so it won't hurt us." Brenda swallowed hard, ignoring the surge of panic rising in her chest. She nodded, trusting him against her better judgment. In the corner of her eye, she glimpsed the paw's dark silhouette on the table, as though it listened, biding its time. They understood, in an unspoken way, that all attempts at logic or normalcy had been shattered by the paw's mere existence. The broken garbage disposal was a chilling testament to the relic's unnatural resilience. Everything now led to the moment Nick would seize upon the paw's rumored power, hoping to outwit the curse that had already claimed so many lives in the past. Brenda placed her faith in his resolve, praying desperately that his plan would not unravel into the same tragic fate as the father from 1902. Both of them stared into the hush of the evening, hearts pounding, fully aware that the final confrontation lay ahead. Nick believed utterly that they could craft wishes to subvert the paw's evil twist. Brenda, undone by fear yet hoping for salvation, could only brace herself for the test that would soon eclipse them all. The tension in the house rose with each passing hour, pressing in like a storm front. They were on the brink, suspended between dread and desperate optimism, preparing to challenge forces they could scarcely comprehend. Part 4. The 3 Foolproof Wishes. Nick awoke to a pale dawn light filtering through the bedroom curtains, already formulating the plan he would set in motion. Months, though it felt like years, of wrestling with the grim possibilities of the monkey's paw had led him to this morning. His notebooks brimmed with scribbled phrases, disclaimers, and revised intentions. He believed he had at last distilled them into a sequence of foolproof wishes, each carefully worded to shield his family from the paw's malevolent twists. Whether that confidence was merited or simply born of desperation, he could not say. He found himself unable to linger in bed. Brenda, eyes shadowed from sleepless nights, stirred at his side but did not speak when he rose. She already sensed his resolve, the tension in his posture. Though he offered a faint smile, she saw an electric current of excitement beneath his composure. He quietly made his way to the study, where he kept the paw wrapped in a soft cloth beside the pages of notes he had compiled. Even from across the room, the relic's presence set him on edge. As the morning wore on, the children emerged from their rooms, still rubbing sleep from their eyes. Sam trudged downstairs in his pajamas, Lisa trailing behind, each glancing anxiously around the house. They hadn't seen the paw in days. Nick had locked it away, claiming to be finalizing ideas. The kids remained uneasy, remembering all too well the nightmares and tensions that began when they discovered the cursed thing. Their father, however, greeted them with an unusual buoyancy, ushering them to the breakfast table with a grin that felt somewhat out of place. Over bowls of cereal, Nick spoke in soft, measured tones about how everything was going to be all right. He insisted he had a plan to handle the paw, to use it in such a way that not only spared them from harm, but ensured a better future. Brenda moved through the kitchen with guarded calm, unwilling to challenge him outright in front of Lisa and Sam. The children listened, exchanging worried glances, uncertain whether to believe their father's assurance or fear a sudden catastrophe. Nick cleared the table quickly once the kids finished eating, as though time itself pressed him onward. He motioned for them to join him in the living room, where the morning sun cast slanting beams over the furniture. The paw lay concealed under a small blanket on the coffee table. Although the children looked uneasy, Nick attempted an upbeat demeanor, explaining that he wanted them all to think of pleasant, simple wishes. A kind of family brainstorming session. "We'll pick the safest ones," he said. "The kind that can't hurt anyone." Lisa perched on the edge of the couch, eyes flicking from Nick to the blanket-shrouded shape. She remembered how frightened Brenda had been whenever that paw was in sight. Sam, too, crossed his arms, as if bracing himself for something unpleasant. Nick, aware of their anxiety, tried to soften the mood with a small laugh. "Think of it like a game," he said, voice bright. "If you could ask the universe for anything, any 3 things, what would they be?" Lisa ventured a hesitant response about maybe wishing for a big treehouse in the yard. Sam, eyes still filled with caution, mentioned wanting a new video game system. At first, their suggestions were childlike, hopeful, and not particularly dangerous. Nick, nodding, probed further. He insisted they come up with ideas that would serve the family as a whole, changes so carefully worded that no one could twist them. Brenda, hovering in the doorway, watched him push the kids toward increasingly detailed suggestions. Little by little, Nick guided the conversation toward practical wishes. He steered them away from fantasies like flying cars and magic powers, emphasizing how they had to be absolutely sure that the paw could not interpret a request in a harmful way. "If we wish for a treehouse," he said, half joking, "maybe a huge branch falls on our house in the process, or it appears in the middle of the living room." His tone was playful, but the underlying truth was serious. They were dealing with a force rumored to warp intentions into perverse outcomes. When Sam asked if they could wish for immortality, Nick paled slightly and shook his head, reminding them how the stories indicated the paw had a dark sense of humor. Brenda, silent yet alert, caught her husband's cautionary glance. She understood his deeper worry, wanting to avoid the same heartbreaks described in century-old legends. Lisa then mentioned money, a straightforward idea. Nick seized on it, pointing out that a monetary wish might be the least complicated. "Imagine we just ask for a comfortable sum," he said, eyebrows lifting. "No tragedies, no weird side effects, just money." Still, the children fretted. What if the paw caused an inheritance to appear after a loved one's death, or orchestrated an insurance payout from an accident? Nick reassured them that he had phrased it with utmost care in his notes. They would specify a certain sum of money arriving through peaceful, legitimate means, harming no one in the process. Brenda shifted nervously. Though she disliked the notion of testing the paw at all, she dared not challenge Nick in front of the kids, who needed to see their parents united. Once money was tentatively settled on as one wish, the family turned to bigger concerns. Lisa pointed out that their greatest fear was losing each other, especially after everything they had heard about the paw's lethal potential. Nick nodded slowly. He had already considered this deeply, drafting a labyrinthine sentence to ensure that no family member would die as a result of the paw's magic or any twist in reality. But as he listened to the children talk, he realized they wanted something simpler, an all-encompassing safeguard that none of them would face an untimely end. His expression brightened when he proposed a second wish. "We'll make sure no one in our family can die, at least not prematurely. Right?" Sam and Lisa traded a glance, uncertain if that was going too far. Brenda cleared her throat softly, and Nick instantly moderated his tone. He clarified that he would wish for health and safety, ensuring that natural lifespans remained intact, with no sudden or violent tragedies. "No one dies in our family," he said, echoing the language scribbled in his notes. The kids took a moment to absorb that. Lisa asked, in a trembling voice, if that meant they would never have to attend another funeral for a relative. Nick hesitated, acknowledging silently that extended relatives and the complexities of fate might not be covered in a few short words. But he tried to reassure her. "Just the immediate family," he said gently. "We want our household to stay safe." He pointed out how it was the best shield he could devise against a malevolent twist, while not inadvertently creating an endless life of suffering. The third wish came about in a less dramatic manner. Sam, half joking, mentioned how jail or prisons seemed like scary places, sparking Lisa to tease him. Nick seized that lighthearted hint, remembering how in old stories, a twisted outcome sometimes involved arrests or wrongful convictions. An idea formed. What if they just wished that no one in their household could ever be incarcerated? He pitched it as a whimsical safeguard, ensuring that even if the paw tried to reconfigure the law around them, it couldn't trap them that way. At first, the children giggled, finding it odd. Nick, though, pressed the logic behind it. "We're covering all the angles here," he said. "If the paw tries to interpret money in some illegal scheme, or tries to make us criminals, it won't be able to send us to jail." Brenda watched in silence, stepping closer to the couch. Her eyes spoke volumes of unease and hesitant acceptance. She had promised to trust his plan, and seeing the children laugh, even if nervously, brought a flicker of relief. Perhaps this was the closest they would come to a sense of calm around the paw. Throughout the conversation, the paw remained under the blanket, as if listening. The children eventually grew more animated, brainstorming small details, half entranced by the possibility of a cursed artifact becoming a beneficial tool. Nick guided them away from grandiose or morally fraught ideas, returning to the foolproof structure he'd devised. Finally, with the kids' help, he settled on 3 official, carefully worded statements. 1. A guaranteed sum of money arriving without harm or injustice. 2. A guarantee that no one in their immediate family would die as a result of any magical twist. 3rd, a safeguard preventing anyone in the family from facing prison, no matter the circumstances. The children, lulled by Nick's confidence, seemed to relax. Lisa ventured a small smile, while Sam perked up at the mention of immediate wealth. Brenda, still overshadowed by caution, forced a measured grin, unwilling to undermine Nick's morale. She appreciated the lengths he went to reassure them and to patch every loophole he could think of. Though her heart pounded, she prayed silently that no hidden catch would slip past his elaborate disclaimers. Evening found them sitting around the living room, each lost in their own thoughts. Nick busied himself rewriting the final versions of the wishes in neat script, ensuring no ambiguous wording lingered. Brenda paced, occasionally glancing at the blanket-draped paw, while Sam and Lisa watched television half-heartedly, their attention clearly drifting back to the conversation they'd had earlier. Outside, the sky dimmed, pinkish clouds tinged with the onset of dusk. A hush settled over the neighborhood, as if nature itself recognized the gravity of what was about to occur. When Nick finally announced it was time, the children exchanged tense looks. Brenda stood near the light switch, her lips pressed into a tight line. None of them spoke as Nick walked to the coffee table and pulled the blanket aside, revealing the paw in all its shriveled, eerie glory. Soft lamplight accentuated the cracks in its leathery surface and the thick tufts of matted fur along its wrist. Even after all their preparation, the sight sent a collective shiver through the family. Nick cleared his throat, then gestured for everyone to gather around. It was a strangely ceremonial moment. He had placed 3 slips of paper on the table beside the paw, each containing one carefully worded wish. With Brenda, Lisa, and Sam hovering close, Nick picked up the paw in his left hand, gingerly cradling it as though it might bite. In his right hand, he clutched the first slip of paper. "I'll read them out," he said, voice quavering but determined. "And then I'll make each wish in turn." The children nodded, eyes wide. Brenda clasped her hands together, pressing them against her chest. She wanted to tell Nick they should stop, or at least reconsider one last time. But something in his expression, the conviction, the intricate planning, silenced her. He looked at the first slip, inhaled sharply, and spoke. "I wish," he began, reading slowly, "that a specific sum of money be bestowed upon my family in a lawful, ethical, and harm-free manner, causing no injury, death, or misfortune to any person, animal, or entity." He paused, finishing in a measured whisper, "So let it be." For a fraught moment, nothing happened. The paw lay motionless, stiff and uncanny in his hand. Sam half expected it to squirm or glow. Lisa's breath caught, anticipating thunder or some eerie manifestation. But all that followed was silence. Nick swallowed hard, pressing onto the second piece of paper. "I wish," he said, voice resonant with rehearsed caution, "that no member of my immediate family, myself, my wife, my children, will die prematurely, violently, or through any accident or misfortune, in any direct or indirect manner related to the paw's influence." Another pause, heavy as iron. Brenda dared to release a tense breath. The overhead lamp flickered once, but it could have been a minor electrical surge. She tried to steady her nerves as Nick proceeded with the third and final wish. "I wish," he read, "that no member of my immediate family will be arrested or imprisoned for any crime, wrongdoing, or misunderstanding, by the design or consequence of the paw's magic, nor by any contrivance stemming from these wishes." He exhaled. "So let it be." He carefully set down the slips of paper, each meticulously worded to block potential tragedies. The children stood in taut suspense, as though waiting for some cosmic reaction to the words. Brenda fidgeted, biting her lip. Nick waited a beat, then gently placed the paw back onto the coffee table. The hush seemed to swell. No dramatic thunderclap rattled the windows. No swirling vortex of supernatural energy. The paw remained as it was, an unsettling relic in a suburban living room. For several seconds, they all stared at one another, disbelief mingling with tentative relief. After the hours of mental labor Nick poured into the wishes, it felt anticlimactic for nothing to happen at all. Sam cleared his throat, asking in a small voice, "Does that mean it worked? Or does it mean it didn't work?" Nick forced a reassuring laugh, setting his hand on Sam's shoulder. "Sometimes with these things, no news is good news," he replied, giving the boy a gentle squeeze. Brenda released her pent-up breath fully, dropping her gaze to the floor. Perhaps the paw's silence indicated success. Lisa, sidling over to the couch, asked if they should put the paw away. Nick nodded, carefully wrapping it in the blanket. Something like a tenuous calm settled over them. With the final words spoken, a subdued hush took hold of the house, almost peaceful in contrast to the frantic dread that preceded it. Brenda felt her pulse gradually slow. She glanced at Nick, who met her eyes and mustered a shaky smile, as if to say, "We made it." The evening wore on without incident. Nick moved around the house, tidying up the aftermath of their ritual. Folded notes, scattered research pages, the leftover blanket. He slipped the paw into a locked drawer in his study, though not as carefully as before. Something in his manner suggested he genuinely believed they had outwitted the curse. Brenda, less certain, offered him a quiet nod. She was relieved enough to see no immediate disaster unfold. Lisa and Sam, initially cautious, soon resumed their regular chatter, even if their voices carried an edge of excitement. They ordered pizza for dinner, a deliberate choice to celebrate. Nick half expected the phone to ring with news of a sudden windfall, some inheritance, a lottery winning, but it remained silent, leaving him to wonder if the paw's powers had simply refused the wishes. Still, the children's spirits lifted as they ate, and Brenda allowed herself to hope that maybe normalcy would return. The tension that had reigned in every corner of their home finally ebbed, replaced by a sense of precarious optimism. Later, with the children in bed, Nick joined Brenda in the living room. The TV played softly, and they curled up on the couch under a single lamp, each lost in thought. Every so often, Nick would open his mouth as if about to say something, then close it. Brenda sensed he was grappling with the quiet aftermath. He had taken such pains to plan each wish, but the paw's magic, if real, remained intangible. She rested her head on his shoulder, a faint tremor in her sigh. "You did your best," she murmured. He kissed her hair, grateful for her support. Yet a subtle anxiety hovered. Brenda recalled that the old legends often began with mundane calm before revealing sinister twists. She tried to banish the thought. The children were safe, no freak accidents had occurred, and no ominous phone call had shattered their evening. At worst, the paw might have proven useless. At best, Nick had indeed outsmarted it. He gently squeezed her hand, murmuring that they should go to bed. She nodded, both of them unwilling to voice the sliver of fear that maybe the silence was just the curse biding its time. They tiptoed through the dim hallway, pausing to peek into the kids' rooms. Sam snored softly, Lisa's breathing steady. Brenda felt an almost overwhelming surge of affection and relief, tears pricking her eyes. For so long she had been haunted by the paw's monstrous aura and the fate it might impose on her family. Now, as she watched her children sleep, she dared believe that Nick's meticulous approach could indeed protect them. Holding her breath, she eased each door shut, heart pounding with a mixture of gratitude and caution. They retired to their own bedroom, switching on the bedside lamps. Nick changed into his pajamas, glancing at his reflection in the mirror. A faint grin tugged at his lips. He looked exhausted but victorious. Brenda settled into bed, leaning against the pillows. She tried to relax her shoulders, feeling the strain of constant vigilance melting away. The bedroom felt safe again, unburdened by the oppressive sense of lurking doom. She pressed a hand against her chest, breathing slowly. Nick slipped under the covers, switching off the main light. A peaceful darkness embraced them, the only illumination a faint glow from the street lamp outside. They lay in silence for a while, each replaying the events of the day, wrestling with the question of whether the paw's power was real or just a superstition. When Brenda finally spoke, her voice was low and tentative. "Do you think we'll notice a change tomorrow? With the money, I mean?" Nick exhaled softly, rolling onto his back. "I don't know," he admitted. "But if it happens, I trust it'll be harmless." His words hung in the air. She nodded, letting her eyes close. Together they drifted toward sleep, lulled by the hush in the house. For the first time in many nights, Brenda felt a glimmer of genuine hope, imagining that the terror might truly be behind them. In the darkest hour of the night, though, a subtle disturbance stirred in the corners of the house. The air conditioner clicked off unexpectedly, and the quiet was replaced by an odd hush. Then, as if flicked by an invisible hand, a small decorative lamp in the hallway blinked once, flooding the corridor with a stark glow. It stayed lit for a few seconds before darkening again. The kids slept on, unaware of the flicker. Even Nick and Brenda, exhausted, did not stir. But the light's brief stutter echoed like a whispered warning. In the kitchen, a strange gust wafted through the window left open for fresh air, rustling the dish towels and sending a faint chill across the floor. A faint rattle of the locked drawer in the study might have gone unheard, or could have been a trick of the wind. The house settled, still and silent, its occupants slumbering on in the belief that all was well. Outside, the street lamp flickered in sympathy, as though nature itself detected an undercurrent of tension that had yet to manifest fully. Morning approached with a gentle wash of pale light. The family awoke to find everything outwardly normal. No missing possessions, no catastrophic phone calls. Nick turned on the coffee pot, feeling a rush of cautious optimism. He asked Brenda, who was leaning against the counter, if she slept better than she had in weeks. She nodded, offering a tentative smile. The children drifted down soon after, yawning, exchanging quiet jokes. For the moment, the air felt lighter. Yet somewhere in the back of each adult's mind, a worry lingered, a near-invisible thread of doubt. The paw had accepted the 3 wishes without apparent fanfare. Was that proof of victory, or a sign that fate plotted a more elaborate turn of events? They might not know until it announced itself with finality. Still, Nick's determination to remain vigilant was evident. He kept his notebook within reach, scanning each phrase he'd used, looking for possible loopholes. Brenda, not wanting to reignite fear, watched him with veiled concern. The day progressed smoothly. Lisa and Sam played outside, laughing freely for the first time since uncovering the paw in the yard. Brenda tidied the house, humming under her breath, finding solace in routine tasks. Nick used the computer to check bank statements, half expecting a sudden influx of funds. His pulse quickened each time the web page refreshed, only to reveal the same modest balance. He told himself it might take time. If indeed the paw was truly bound by their words, at least it wasn't conjuring horrors. As evening approached, Nick and Brenda quietly reflected on the unfolding calm. They dared to hope the 3 foolproof wishes had truly outwitted the curse. Certainly nothing catastrophic had arrived to twist their words. Perhaps they had done what no previous owner could, navigating every semantic trap with skill and caution. Brenda even ventured a small laugh when Nick teased her about paying off the garbage disposal repair with their future windfall. But in the hush after supper, as the family gathered in the living room to watch a movie, an odd tension stirred. A deep sense of disquiet overshadowed them, though no one could pinpoint its source. The television flickered, then stabilized. Lisa commented that the room felt chilly, prompting Sam to fetch a blanket. When Nick rose to adjust the thermostat, he found the hallway light once again blinking erratically, then going dark. He tapped it, blaming a loose bulb. He returned to the couch, forcing a grin as the children asked if everything was all right. Brenda noted the flicker too, a silent chill running down her spine. The paw remained locked away, presumably inert. Yet a small, creeping doubt sank into her stomach. The sense that they were perched on the edge of something unseen. Nick took her hand, pressing it gently. She squeezed back, uncertain and frightened by that intangible disquiet. The moment passed. The rest of the evening was uneventful. The children dozed off midway through the movie, and Brenda carried them to bed, one by one. Nick offered to tidy up, collecting snack wrappers and turning off the television. The house was again dark, save for a few nightlights. The hush that settled felt tense, a near silence humming with unspoken possibility. Nick found himself glancing at the locked drawer in his study, tempted to ensure the paw was still contained. He resisted, telling himself he had to break free of the paranoia. Brenda approached him, arms folded, wearing an uneasy expression. He smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "We're safe," he assured her, voice soft yet firm. She nodded wordlessly, letting him guide her upstairs. In the corridor, that same bulb flickered one more time, a faint pop echoing before it steadied. Brenda paused, her gaze trailing upward. Nick placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, and together they proceeded, trying not to let the subtle warning signs erode their new peace. They settled into bed once more. The house grew still, blanketed in the hush of late night. Outside, a faint wind stirred the trees. The only disturbance was the occasional drip from a faucet in the master bathroom, the steady plink of water into the sink. Nick told himself to call a plumber soon, if they truly had the funds coming. Brenda dozed off, lulled by exhaustion. Nick lay awake a bit longer, replaying the exact wording of his wishes, mentally checking for oversights. Eventually, fatigue claimed him too, and he drifted into a dreamless sleep. Downstairs, the locked drawer remained closed. No breeze unsettled the items within. Everything seemed as it should be, with the paw inert and hidden. Yet in the stillness, a hush of possibility thickened, as though the very air held its breath. Only time would reveal whether Nick's cunning had matched the relic's insidious nature. For now, the Thompson household believed itself shielded by clever phrasing, lulled into a fragile sense of security. The night enveloped them all. Outside the windows, Street lamps glowed faintly, illuminating the quiet suburb. The paw, so recently brandished for its final function, lay unmoving. A sense of calm prevailed, tenuous but real, buoyed by Nick's confidence. Brenda, her dreams untroubled for once, rested with the unspoken hope that a new chapter awaited them, a happier one, freed from dread. Lisa and Sam breathed the slow, even rhythm of children who trust in their parents' plans. Sometime around midnight, a tiny patter of rain began on the roof. This gentle sound, rather than a portent of doom, soothed the walls and crept through the darkness as if washing the tension away. In a different world, it might have been the perfect lullaby after a day of triumph. Yet an unseen thread lingered, a ripple of intangible energy that occasionally brushed the edge of awareness. Nick, half rising from slumber, felt his heart flutter without reason, then sank back into the pillows. He told himself the quiet was a sign of their victory, that all was finally well. If only the flickering light or the inexplicable chill in the hallway had never existed, the family might have slept in perfect contentment. Unbeknownst to them, seeds of mystery took root in the paw's silence, leaving them unaware of the deeper consequences. For now, however, that hush reigned supreme, and Nick's carefully articulated phrases remained unchallenged. The stage was set, the lines drawn, and the Thompson family remained blissfully certain they had outwitted fate itself. Part 5. The Cursed Alternate Life. Nick woke to unfamiliar sunlight spilling across sleek hardwood floors, his head throbbing as if he'd slept on a bed of rocks. He lay in a king-sized bed with crisp linen sheets of a far finer thread count than anything he and Brenda owned. Confusion settled in first, dull and insistent. He tried to recall falling asleep at home, the comforting shapes of the master bedroom. But this was definitely not his house. A vast modern painting hung on the opposite wall, all sharp angles and swirling colors, the sort of abstract piece he would have dismissed as pretentious. Groggy, he pushed himself upright, scanning the room in disbelief. There was no sign of Brenda, and that fact seemed more disorienting than anything else. He tugged away the impossibly soft duvet, swung his legs over the edge, and felt the smoothness of polished wood under his feet. The next detail that struck him was his attire. He wore expensive lounge pants he didn't recognize, and a t-shirt emblazoned with the logo of an upscale designer brand. The bedroom itself looked like a suite from a magazine spread, all stainless steel fixtures, glass furniture, and a panoramic window overlooking a city skyline. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass, he glimpsed tall buildings, impossibly glossy in the morning sun, with no trace of the modest suburban landscape he was used to. He muttered Brenda's name, expecting to hear her footsteps, maybe see her in an adjacent room. Silence pressed back at him, thick and sterile. A prickle of unease ran down his spine. Slowly, he made his way to the window, the broad daylight revealing the lofty vantage. He seemed to be on at least the 30th floor of a luxury high-rise, the streets below teeming with traffic and pedestrians. Panic fluttered in his chest. Where was he? And where was his family? He pressed a hand to the glass, half wishing it would dissolve so he could leap free of this baffling dream. His phone sat on a glass nightstand by the bed, a top-of-the-line model he didn't remember buying. With shaking fingers, he picked it up, swiped to unlock the screen, and found a polished wallpaper of geometric lines in midnight blue. No photo of Brenda, no picture of the kids. Even the icons looked unfamiliar, a suite of productivity apps he'd never heard of. A flurry of notifications greeted him. Messages from colleagues, reminders of upcoming meetings. His pulse quickened, reading the subject lines. Words like executive briefing and stock options glared at him, alien yet apparently relevant to this new life. He found a wallet on a nearby dresser, rummaging through crisp business cards that read, Nicholas Thompson, Senior Partner, Crosswell Marketing and PR. His own name, yes, but he'd never even heard of Crosswell before. He stared, uncomprehending, flipping through credit cards with limits he couldn't fathom, all under his name. At the back was a driver's license that bore his face but listed a downtown address, the very building he now stood in. A date of birth that matched his own, yet no mention of Brenda or the life they'd built. The stark dissonance twisted his stomach. The condo's main hallway was wide, with black marble floors and a minimalistic flair that exuded wealth. He walked in a daze, calling Brenda's name again, this time louder. The echoes bounced back at him, mocking. No reply. He thought of Lisa and Sam, how they would have run to him if he called. A wave of nausea hit him. Everything felt unmoored, as though the world had realigned overnight. A modern clock on the wall confirmed it was 7:30 a.m., meaning the school day would have begun soon, were he still in the old reality. Desperate for answers, Nick hurried to the front door. The hallway outside was immaculate, lined with recessed lighting and abstract sculpture niches. Stabbing the elevator button, he tried to maintain composure, but his heart threatened to gallop out of his chest. The elevator arrived with a subdued chime, and he stepped into a mirrored interior that reflected a man he barely recognized. His hair was neatly styled, his pajamas more stylish than most of his entire wardrobe used to be. When the door slid open on the ground floor, the building's polished lobby showcased a concierge desk, marble columns, and plush seating areas that smelled of expensive cologne. A sharply dressed doorman nodded briskly. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson. Your driver's outside whenever you're ready," he said with professional cheer, the sort of tone reserved for high-profile tenants. Nick opened his mouth, searching for words, but only managed a stiff nod. The mention of a driver sent his pulse racing further. A steady hum of conversation and foot traffic surrounded him. Men and women in tailored suits passed by, glancing at him with polite recognition. Nobody questioned his presence, as though his being there was the most natural thing in the world. Outside, a sleek black sedan idled at the curb, the uniformed driver stepping forward to open the door. "Morning, sir," the driver greeted, tilting his cap. Nick froze, unsure whether to ignore the man or climb in. Instead, he sidestepped, muttering something about needing a walk, and hurried off, ignoring the quizzical look thrown his way. The city air felt different, crisper, more electric with commerce than the suburban hush he remembered. Towering skyscrapers loomed overhead. There was no sign of the quiet cul-de-sac where Lisa and Sam played, no evidence that such a world existed here. Nick's thoughts churned. The last memory he had of home was that final night. The paw, the carefully worded wishes, and the relief that nothing catastrophic had happened. They had all gone to bed feeling victorious, believing they had outsmarted the curse. Now, faced with an entirely new life, he realized how profoundly mistaken he'd been. The paw had reconfigured his reality in some cunning way. Though he had no proof yet, he sensed that the second wish, "no one in the family dies," had twisted itself into a hideous rearrangement of events. Remove the family altogether, so they could not die. A nauseating logic, so typical of twisted magic. He spun in a slow circle on the busy sidewalk, scanning the unfamiliar intersections. Cars roared past. Well-dressed people hurried by, oblivious to his silent panic. He pulled his phone from his pocket, attempting to dial Brenda. The contact list displayed an array of corporate names, clients, executives, but no Brenda anywhere. His fingers trembled as he tapped in her number from memory, only to hear an automated message stating the line was not in service. For Lisa and Sam, he had no direct line to call. They never had personal phones, being so young. He tried a voice command, begging the device to find any record of his wife, but it returned nothing. Growing desperate, Nick hailed a cab. The driver gave him an impatient glance. Heart hammering, he asked to be taken to the suburb where he used to live. The driver looked puzzled, explaining it was a long trip. Nick only nodded. As they sped through highways, Nick's anxiety mounted. He kept trying Brenda's number on repeat. Every call produced the same void. He sifted through email after email on his phone, searching for any mention of the family, but found only business memos, meeting invites, marketing proposals. Not a single personal note about his children or wife. When they reached the familiar region, or what should have been familiar, Nick's confusion morphed into heartbreak. The streets looked almost the same, yet the houses bore subtle differences. The yard that once belonged to the Thompsons was now an empty lot, ringed by a "for sale" sign. No sign of Lisa's swing set, no daisies in Brenda's garden. The neighborhood itself seemed partially rebranded, and the timelines blurred. Even the street name was slightly altered. His mouth went dry. At the driver's insistent question about whether he wanted to be dropped off, Nick could only mutter a shaky, "No." his vision hazed with alarm. He asked if there was a family named Thompson living anywhere nearby. The driver shrugged, unconvinced. A quick scan of local listings, done on Nick's phone, confirmed no mention of Brenda Thompson or the children. Nick stumbled out of the cab, ignoring the driver's protests about the fare. He stood in front of what was once his home, the vacant plot a cruel symbol of the life that had vanished. Even the big pine tree that once loomed in the backyard was nowhere in sight. Nick felt the surge of tears behind his eyes, a twisted panic lodging in his chest. Where were they? Could they be alive somewhere else? Desperate, he asked neighbors, but no one recognized the names he provided. Most gave him polite, puzzled expressions, shaking their heads. The sense of unreality intensified. His phone buzzed repeatedly with corporate calls from people expecting him in a board meeting. He let them go to voicemail, staggering down the sidewalk as though wounded. Everything felt wrong. The paw had warped his existence. He was alive, well off, apparently thriving in a career that demanded his undivided attention. Yet there was no trace of the people he loved most. Nick's mind reeled back to the night he made those so-called foolproof wishes. Money, to ensure no family tragedies, and the vow that no one in his family would die or go to jail. Instead of witnessing family tragedy, he realized, the paw simply erased his family from the equation. They'd never existed. That was how it ensured no one died, by extracting them from Nick's life entirely. The cruelty of it stole his breath, an agony deeper than any bullet or blade could inflict. He sank onto a bench, ignoring the stares of passers-by, burying his face in his hands. Hours blurred together. He searched public directories, library archives, anything that might prove Brenda and the kids once occupied the same timeline as him. Each search ended in a void. Brenda Russell apparently lived thousands of miles away, with no record of a Nick Thompson in her life. The children, Lisa and Sam, yielded no matches, no birth certificates, no mention at all. The erasure seemed absolute, orchestrated by the paw's cunning. Some primal part of Nick wanted to howl at the sky, rage at the cosmic injustice he had invited upon himself. Eventually, hammered by exhaustion, he returned to the condo building. The doorman greeted him with professional courtesy, oblivious to Nick's shattered expression. In the elevator's mirrored walls, Nick saw a hollow-eyed man who still wore high-end clothes and carried a phone that demanded he address urgent matters. The contradiction made him physically ill. He clung to a desperate hope that maybe Brenda existed in the city somewhere, that she might step off the elevator at any moment. But every door leading off the hallway belonged to someone else. The condo, so opulent and cold, offered no comfort. Inside, the place felt like a meticulously curated showroom. Everything sleek, expensive, devoid of personal touches. The fridge was stocked with healthy, upscale groceries, and a schedule pinned to a glass board listed appointments for the next month. Nothing mentioned birthdays, anniversaries, or family outings. Nick sank into a leather chair in the living area. Floor-to-ceiling windows displayed a panoramic cityscape tinged with the fiery hues of sunset. He despised the spectacle, resenting its lavishness, longing only for Brenda's warm presence and the kids' laughter. Rage and despair warred within him. Images of the original timeline flooded his thoughts. Sam digging in the yard, Lisa's grin when she made a silly joke, Brenda's anxious but loving gaze when Nick proposed the 3 wishes. How had he been so foolish to believe they could cheat a curse? He cursed himself for not discarding the paw sooner. Every word of his foolproof plan mocked him now, revealing the cunning labyrinth of the paw's logic. No one dies if they do not exist. No heartbreak if there's no family left to break his heart. In a surge of frantic energy, he tore through every drawer, every cabinet, searching for the paw. If it had reshaped his life, it had to be here somewhere. Desperation roiled in his gut. After rummaging through closets, rifling through furniture, and upending boxes, he found it tucked in an elegant wooden case near the bookshelf. Rage spiked. The paw looked the same as ever, shriveled, half-furred, thoroughly repugnant. He snatched it up, hardly caring if it might deliver another twisted blow. If he couldn't have the life he cherished, he'd cast this abomination away, rid himself of its malignant power forever. He nearly hurled it off the condo balcony right then, but dread stayed his hand. Knowing the paw, it might land safely on a ledge, or someone else might recover it. Instead, He placed it in a black duffel bag and stormed out, ignoring calls from perplexed colleagues. The driver perked up at Nick's entrance into the elevator, but Nick barked an order for him to stand down. The doorman, startled by his furious expression, opened the front door without a word. Night had fallen, the city alive with neon signs and glinting headlights. Nick strode through the busy sidewalks until he found a car rental kiosk, refusing to let any of the staff from his new life direct him. Soon, he was behind the wheel of a rented SUV, heading toward the coast. The paw remained zipped away in the bag on the passenger seat, but he felt its malignant presence seeping through the black fabric. The city lights receded behind him as he navigated the highways in a daze. Hours of driving passed with mechanical determination. He had but one goal: get this cursed relic as far from him as possible, hurl it into the ocean if need be, let it sink to the depths, never to ruin another life. The radio hissed with static, then the local news droned about financial markets, a topic that might have intrigued him in this new persona, but now only fueled his rage. He snapped it off, leaving him alone with the rhythmic thrum of tires on asphalt. The night sky offered no comfort, the stars veiled by a haze of clouds. His thoughts turned inward, replaying the day's horror. Each recollection felt like a dagger: the vacant lot, the non-existent phone numbers, the casual address of Mr. Thompson, by people who had no idea he was anything but a well-groomed executive. When at last he reached the coastal road, the crash of waves became audible through the open windows. The smell of salt air mingled with the sting of his tears, which he blinked away angrily. Headlights illuminated a stretch of barren beach, the tide creeping in under the moonlight. Nick parked in a secluded area. The engine clicked as it cooled, but Nick could barely register the sound. He gripped the duffel bag, stepped out, and trudged across the sand. Each step felt like walking through mud, weighed down by grief and fury. He found an outcropping of rocks jutting into the water, the waves smacking against their sides. The ocean spread before him in an expanse of black, flecked with silver by the moon. Adrenaline coursed through his veins. He tore open the bag, withdrawing the paw with trembling hands. For an instant, he studied it under the faint moonlight. It looked so small, so unimposing, yet its power had wrenched apart his entire existence. Memories of Brenda's warm smile and Sam's goofy laugh hammered at him, each a reminder of what he'd lost. "You took them from me," he hissed, voice cracking. The night swallowed his accusation. A seagull wheeled overhead, startled from its perch by his tone. No supernatural voice answered. The paw remained silent, a mere object in all appearances. Still, Nick envisioned it laughing at him, mocking his arrogance. He raised it high, teeth gritted. Part of him wanted to try another wish, to beg for everything to be reversed. But he couldn't risk unleashing a worse outcome. He'd learned enough about the paw's cruelty to know it would only seize upon any new wording, sowing more anguish. "All I wanted was to protect them," he whispered, tears finally spilling down his cheeks. He recalled Brenda's pleas, the children's innocent hopes, the moment he believed the paw would fulfill their harmless requests. Now he stood alone under an indifferent moon, family ripped away by the paw's insidious logic. He pressed his lips to the cursed thing in a final bitter farewell, tasting the stale odor of dust and time. A sob wrenched from his throat, a raw expression of heartbreak he could neither quell nor fully grasp. With all the force he could muster, he hurled the paw into the tumultuous surf. It flew in a blurred arc, landing with a faint splash that vanished beneath the rolling water. He watched the waves churn, half expecting the paw to bob to the surface, unstoppable as always. But the darkness swallowed it. No glimmer, no further sign, only the relentless hiss of the tide. Nick stood, panting, tears tracing hot lines down his cheeks. He felt no relief, just a hollow ache, the knowledge that his loved ones remained locked in some unreachable timeline. Time slipped by, measured in the steady crash of the sea. Nick tried to breathe, to remind himself that maybe, by discarding the paw, he could end its interference. Yet the reality around him stayed the same. Somewhere in a towering condo, there was a bed with his name on the lease, a career that beckoned for his presence. But the people he cared about, Brenda, Lisa, Sam, were beyond his grasp. Exhausted, he slumped onto the wet sand, letting the waves lap at his shoes. He stared at the sky, searching for a star bright enough to offer hope. He recalled the old stories describing how families were tricked into ruin by their own desires. He joined their ranks, believing he could outsmart the paw with carefully crafted wishes. Instead, he'd inadvertently bartered his greatest treasures, the wife and children he cherished. The wind tugged at his hair, carrying the scent of brine. He felt an ugly emptiness expand in his chest, threatening to consume him. In this new life, he had wealth, success, status, but none of it mattered in the absence of those who gave his days meaning. Eventually, numb and shivering, he forced himself to stand. The paw was gone, lost beneath the black water. Perhaps it would remain there, or perhaps the tides would carry it to some distant shore, into the hands of another unsuspecting soul. The thought chilled him, but there was nothing more he could do. The damage had been done. He trudged back to the SUV, shoulders hunched, each step a reminder of the reality that had enveloped him. No matter how far he traveled, no matter what he did, his family was gone. When he climbed into the driver's seat, the overhead light illuminated his devastated reflection in the rearview mirror. A man with puffy eyes and streaks of sand on his designer clothes stared back. Defeat weighed on him like a physical burden, sapping his will. He gripped the steering wheel, uncertain of where to go or what to do next. In the back of his mind, a frantic voice suggested maybe there was a way to fix it, to find the paw, and make a new wish. But his battered soul balked at the thought. He refused to meddle with that cursed artifact again. He sat in the quiet darkness, listening to the ocean's roar in the distance. Rage simmered beneath his sorrow. Rage at himself for believing in a quick fix, at the paw for twisting his intentions, at the entire universe for allowing such an abomination to exist. But the fury offered no solution, only a hollow sense of blame. He closed his eyes, tears slipping silently down his cheeks, and whispered apologies to his absent family. A starless sky offered no comfort, the heavy clouds rolling in to smother what little moonlight remained. Ultimately, he started the engine, the mechanical rumble feeling oddly invasive in the hush of the beach. Headlights cut through the darkness, reflecting on the damp sand, and he pulled away with no real destination in mind. He no longer felt worthy of returning to that opulent condo, nor did he have anywhere else to go. A humorless laugh escaped him. Despite the illusions of triumph, he was utterly alone. His phone buzzed on the console, likely more corporate messages. He ignored it, his heart too shattered to care. With the paw gone, this was the life he was left with. A lonely existence, lavish and loveless. As he merged onto the deserted road, the city lights hovered on the horizon. His thoughts spiraled back to Brenda's gentle smile, the warmth in her eyes when she said his name, the way Lisa and Sam once ran up for bedtime hugs. He clung to those memories, afraid they might fade in a reality that insisted they never existed. Whatever timeline he inhabited now, the paw had snatched away everything dear to him. He grit his teeth, tears welling again. He had thrown the cursed relic into the sea, but the cost it exacted remained immeasurable. He drove aimlessly, hours drifting by in a haze. Dawn threatened on the horizon by the time he approached the city's outskirts again. Billboards loomed overhead, advertising products of no interest to him. The phone insisted on providing updates about his executive schedule, meeting times, urgent memos. Each beep felt like a deranged joke, pushing him to engage with a world built on the ashes of his real life. He wanted nothing more than to vanish, retreat to some hidden corner of the earth. But that would solve nothing. Brenda and the kids would still not exist in this twisted present. In a final act of defiance, he pulled onto a deserted street, tossed the phone onto the passenger seat, and stared out the windshield. The skyline was tinted by the first glow of sunrise. He whispered one last goodbye to the life that had sustained him. The late-night laughter in the Thompson house, the worried but steadfast love in Brenda's eyes, the sibling banter of Lisa and Sam, all of it replaced by a cunning emptiness. He rested his forehead against the steering wheel, tears slipping onto the smooth leather, knowing the paw was no longer there to mock him. For a moment, a wild notion flickered in his mind. If the paw survived in the ocean, maybe someone would find it. Maybe it would alter reality again. Yet he couldn't bring himself to linger on such possibilities. This was the bed he had made, or rather, the conjured dimension the paw had laid at his feet. Though undone by grief, he felt a sliver of grim relief at having hurled the paw away. Whatever new nightmares it might unleash on another hapless soul, at least it was no longer in his possession. At length, the sun broke the horizon, lighting the city in pale gold. Nick inhaled slowly, gazing at the reflection of sky in the glass towers. It felt like a foreign realm, a place that might as well have existed on another planet. Without Brenda and the kids, no measure of success or wealth could make it home. He felt hollow, drifting through a script meant for someone else's life. Each moment hammered home the truth. The paw had outmaneuvered him, punishing him for tampering with fate. He remained in the car, paralyzed by indecision, until the light grew bright enough to force him to squint. That was when he eased the SUV back into motion, crawling through nearly empty streets. The city awakened slowly, forming a backdrop of normalcy that mocked his devastation. Taxis zipped around corners, office workers emerged from cafes, the flow of commerce resumed. Nobody saw Nick's anguish, and if they did, they offered no solace. Here, he was just another power figure, privileged and isolated, doomed to wander without the anchor of his family. Eventually, the roads guided him toward the condo tower once again. Parking in the subterranean garage, he felt numb, as though going through the motions of a stranger's routine. Upstairs, the doorman greeted him, but Nick breezed past without acknowledgement, stepping into the silent elevator. The reflection in the mirror was that of a man undone by sorrow, hair disheveled, eyes rimmed with red. When the doors opened onto his lavish hallway, he shuffled through, pressing his keycard into the lock. Inside, nothing had changed. The same pristine surfaces, the same empty hush. Nick stood at the window, gazing out at the city. Tears stung his eyes one more time, but he let them fall without restraint. Discarding the paw should have felt like liberation, but it only deepened his loss. The children he had tucked into bed now belonged to a vanished timeline. He saw their faces in his mind, heard the echoes of their voices. He'd do anything to hold them again, to tell Brenda how sorry he was. But the paw's malignant gift had turned his wish into a prison of prosperity, an eerie kingdom with no rightful heirs. He closed his eyes, recalling the swirl of the ocean, the feeling of the paw leaving his grip. Had it sunk to the seabed, or was it drifting among the waves, ready to ensnare another dreamer? He would never know. If some vestige of cosmic mercy remained, perhaps that cursed relic would never resurface. But mercy felt scarce in a world shaped by unnatural bargains. Taking a trembling breath, Nick prayed that somehow, somewhere, Brenda and the kids might still feel the trace of his love, even if they existed only as memories in his ravaged heart. Thus ended the final chapter of his frantic hope. He had hurled the paw away, but its damage was irreversible. He clung to the faintest spark of acceptance that he'd done what he could to prevent further calamity, though it offered little comfort. The city stretched out before him like a maze, bright and hollow, an alien future as inescapable as it was unwanted. Nick sank to his knees, pressing his palm to the cold glass, whispering Brenda's name, whispering apologies, listening to the quiet echo of a life that no longer was. Part 6. The Final Resolution. It was several months after the dark days of old that fate, in a quiet twist, revealed a new beginning on a windswept beach. In the tender blush of early morning, 12-year-old Sarah wandered along a nearly deserted shoreline. The tide had receded far enough to expose the secrets of the sand, and amid the scattered shells and driftwood, something unusual caught her eye, a small, battered object glinting dully in the pale light. Curiosity piqued, Sarah knelt and brushed away layers of damp sand. There, half buried near the water's edge, lay a relic so incongruous against the gentle sweep of the sea. A shriveled, time-worn hand, unmistakably resembling a monkey's paw. Its surface was etched with faded, intricate lines, and though its form was marred by salt and erosion, it retained an eerie dignity that sent a shiver down her spine. Sarah's heart pounded with a mixture of trepidation and wonder. Even as she held the relic in her small hands, she felt a subtle vibration beneath her fingertips, as though the object were imbued with a long-forgotten pulse. In that moment, Memories stirred of the whispered legends from her school lessons. In class, during a quiet reading session on folklore, she had listened to a teacher recount the notorious tale of the monkey's paw, a cursed artifact reputed to grant wishes with a twist so cruel that hope itself became entangled in sorrow. The details, the grief of a desperate father, the tragic consequences of tampered desires, had haunted Sarah's thoughts. Now, as the relic rested against her palm, she instantly recognized the infamous object of legend. It was as if the faded pages of history had stepped forth onto the beach, calling her to complete a destiny that had lain dormant for far too long. That evening, under the vast canvas of a star-strewn sky, Sarah returned to her modest home clutching the relic. Alone in her room, with only the murmuring of the ocean in her ears, she carefully set the monkey's paw on her desk. Its presence, ominous yet strangely compelling, stirred within her a resolve she had never known. Rather than fear its reputed power, she resolved to transform its legacy. In the soft glow of her desk lamp, Sarah opened a fresh journal and began to write, a quiet, deliberate act of defiance against a history filled with dread. She believed that perhaps the curse could be undone, that by using the very power meant to twist fate, she might instead recast it in the light of hope. With trembling determination, she set forth 3 wishes, each intended not for selfish gain, but to restore what was precious and pure. Her first wish was for family safety. In careful looping script, she wrote, "May my family always be safe from harm, shielded by love and guarded by unseen benevolence, so that no misfortune may ever befall us." As she read the words aloud, the sound of her voice mingled with the rhythmic rush of the sea. It was a gentle incantation, a promise meant to fortify the bonds of those she held dear. In her heart, she pictured her parents smiling, her siblings laughing in a carefree home, protected from the terrors of a capricious world. Next, with a deep, steadying breath, Sarah turned to her second wish. She penned, "May our lives be filled with enduring happiness, where each day blossoms with laughter, joy, and the quiet magic of genuine togetherness." The wish, imbued with a yearning for a future free of sorrow, resonated like a soft hymn. It spoke of a life where the harshness of fate was softened by the tender resilience of love, a life where even modest means could be transformed into abundant blessings. Finally, Sarah faced the most difficult wish of all. With the weight of history pressing upon her, she wrote her third wish. "May the cursed monkey's paw vanish into oblivion, concealed for all time so that its dark influence may trouble us nevermore." The act of writing these words felt both liberating and profound. In that moment, she realized that to reclaim the future, it was necessary to erase the past. The relic, a symbol of misfortune and twisted desire, must be forever banished if her family was ever to live free from its shadow. When the last word was inscribed, Sarah closed her journal and walked to the beach once more, the cool night air whispering around her. The moon hung low, its silver beams illuminating the shoreline in a spectral glow. Kneeling on the soft sand where the waves had gently receded, she laid the battered monkey's paw before her. In the quiet solitude of that sacred place, Sarah recited her 3 wishes with clear, unwavering voice. First, she invoked family safety, then enduring happiness, and finally, she called upon the power of the universe to ensure the paw's eternal concealment. As her words mingled with the sighing wind and the murmur of the sea, an almost imperceptible change began to occur. The relic, which had once seemed so solid and unyielding, started to shimmer faintly under the moonlight. Its rough, aged surface appeared to soften, as though the dark energies that had long clung to it were dissolving into the night. Sarah watched in awed silence as the edges of the cursed object blurred and disintegrated, minute particles cascading onto the sand like a gentle snowfall. The transformation was subtle, yet profound, an exorcism of old maledictions by the simple, pure power of a heartfelt wish. In that cathartic moment, as the remnants of the monkey's paw melted away and were carried off by a tender breeze, the beach itself seemed to exhale a long-held sigh of relief. The ocean, vast and eternal, lapped at the shore with renewed calm, as if celebrating the end of an era of sorrow. The burdens of ancient curses were lifted, replaced by a luminous promise of renewal. Sarah felt a warm surge of hope swell within her, a feeling that the future, though modest, could be filled with a genuine and lasting joy. In the weeks and months that followed, the memory of that transformative night took root in Sarah's heart. Life, once shadowed by legends of dark magic and doomed wishes, began to blossom in quiet, persistent ways. Her family, though not endowed with riches or grandeur, found solace in small blessings: a shared meal at the dinner table, laughter echoing through a humble living room, gentle reassurances in every tender glance. There was no miraculous influx of wealth or sudden reversal of fate. Instead, there was something more enduring: a return to the simple, unadorned truth of living. Each day, Sarah's family built upon the foundation of that hopeful night, their bonds strengthened by the knowledge that love and safety were not the products of fate's whims, but the result of deliberate, heartfelt intention. At school, Sarah's recollections of the old story, the legend of the monkey's paw, became a quiet symbol of triumph over darkness. Teachers recounted the cautionary tale as a lesson in the perils of tampering with destiny. But Sarah knew a different truth. For in that story, she had discovered that even the most fearsome curse could be undone by the purity of a wish. Her own experience had taught her that while legends may carry the weight of sorrow, they also hold the potential for renewal if one is brave enough to reimagine them. In the pages of her journal, she chronicled the journey from terror to hope, a narrative not of despair, but of transformation and gentle victory. As time went on, the beach where the cursed relic had once washed ashore became a place of quiet pilgrimage for Sarah. Each visit filled her with a profound sense of gratitude. The memory of the dark days was not forgotten, but it was transformed into a beacon of resilience, a reminder that even in the face of relentless misfortune, the human heart could shine with an unquenchable light. The ocean, constant and vast, served as a silent witness to her resolve, its ceaseless rhythm echoing the promise of new beginnings. It was as if the sea itself had absorbed the remnants of the ancient curse, consigning them to oblivion so that life could once again take root in its gentle, enduring way. In the soft glow of a late afternoon sun, Sarah would often sit on the warm sand, gazing out at the rolling waves, and reflect on the power of her wishes. The memory of that transformative ritual, the day when 3 simple desires had rewritten her family's destiny, filled her with a quiet certainty. She knew that the road ahead might be filled with challenges, as all lives inevitably are, but she also understood that the strength to overcome them lay within each tender moment of love and connection. Her family, modest though they were, had become a living testament to the idea that happiness was not measured by material wealth, but by the warmth of shared laughter and the steadfast support found in each other's arms. In time, Sarah's story spread quietly among those who valued hope over despair. Friends and neighbors spoke of the miraculous night when a cursed relic dissolved into the sand, and with it, the weight of an ancient malediction. The tale, once shrouded in the gloom of horror, had become an emblem of redemption, a symbol that even the darkest curses could be lifted by the sincerity of a pure heart. Sarah's family continued to live simply but joyfully, their days punctuated by small celebrations and heartfelt moments that spoke of a resilience beyond measure. Every smile, every warm embrace, every shared secret became a quiet victory over a legacy that had once threatened to rob them of their very souls. Now, as the years passed and the memory of the cursed relic faded into myth, Sarah carried with her the gentle assurance that life, no matter how modest, could be an endless source of hope and renewal. The ocean's timeless rhythm, the soft murmur of the tide, and the whisper of the wind through the dunes all testified to the truth that even a cursed past could be washed away by the simple, unwavering power of love and intention. The dark legacy of the monkey's paw had been erased, dissolved into the sands and carried off by the eternal tides, leaving behind a future unburdened by fear and regret. In that final, serene moment on the beach, as the first golden rays of dawn crept over the horizon, Sarah rose slowly from the sand, with a heart lightened by the promise of a new day. The memory of the battered relic was now only a distant echo, a cautionary tale transformed into a source of strength and inspiration. She looked out over the endless expanse of the ocean, feeling deeply that every ending was also a beginning, and that the future belonged to those who dared to wish for goodness, despite the shadows of the past. With each step she took away from the shoreline, Sarah carried forward the lessons learned on that fateful night. She vowed to nurture the happiness of her family, to safeguard their love with every breath, and to honor the gentle power of hope that had brought them through their darkest hours. In the quiet cadence of the morning, as the beach slowly filled with the soft hum of life returning, Sarah embraced the final resolution, a future where safety, joy, and a life untainted by old curses were hers to cherish forever. And so, in the warm embrace of a hopeful new dawn, the cursed relic was gone, a faded memory lost to the endless tide, and in its place, the gentle, enduring promise of a life filled with love and peace blossomed anew. The end.